by the light of the tallow candle, which had been placed on one end of a rough table, a man was reading something written in a book. It was an old account book, greatly worn, and the writing was not, apparently, very legible, for the man sometimes held the page close to the flame of the candle to get a stronger light upon it. The shadow of the book would then throw into obscurity a half of the room, darkening a number of faces and figures. For besides the reader, 8 other men were present. 7 of them sat against the rough log walls, silent and motionless, and the room being small, not very far from the table. By extending an arm, any one of them could have touched the 8th man, who lay on the table, face upward, partly covered by a sheet. His arms at his sides. He was dead. The man with the book was not reading aloud, and no one spoke. All seemed to be waiting for something to occur. The dead man only was without expectation. From the blank darkness outside came in, through the aperture that served for a window, all the ever unfamiliar noises of the night in the wilderness. The long, nameless note of a distant coyote, the stilly, pulsing thrill of tireless insects in trees, strange cries of night birds, so different from those of the birds of day, the drone of great blundering beetles, and all that mysterious chorus of small sounds that seem always to have been but half heard when they have suddenly ceased, as if conscious of an indiscretion. But nothing of all this was noted in that company. Its members were not overmuch addicted to idle interests in matters of no practical importance. That was obvious in every line of their rugged faces, obvious even in the dim light of the single candle. They were evidently men of the vicinity, farmers and woodmen. The person reading was a trifle different. One would have said of him that he was of the world, worldly, albeit there was that in his attire which attested a certain fellowship with the organisms of his environment. His coat would hardly have passed muster in San Francisco. His footgear was not of urban origin, and the hat that lay by him on the floor, he was the only one uncovered, was such that, if one had considered it as an article of mere personal adornment, he would have missed its meaning. In countenance, the man was rather prepossessing, with just a hint of sternness, though that he may have assumed or cultivated as appropriate to one in authority. For he was a coroner. It was by virtue of his office that he had possession of the book in which he was reading, if it had been found among the dead man's effects, in his cabin, where the inquest was now taking place. When the coroner had finished reading, he put the book into his breast pocket. At that moment, the door was pushed open and a young man entered. He clearly was not one of mountain birth and breeding. He was clad as those who dwell in cities. His clothing was dusty, however, as from travel. He had, in fact, been riding hard to attend the inquest. The coroner nodded. No one else greeted him.
"We have waited for you,"
said the coroner.
"It is necessary to have done with this business tonight."
The young man smiled.
"I'm sorry to have kept you,"
he said.
"I went away not to evade your summons, but to post to my newspaper an account of what I suppose I'm called back to relate."
The coroner smiled.
"The account that you posted to your newspaper,"
he said,
"differs probably from that which you will give here under oath."
"That,"
replied the other, rather hotly and with a visible flush,
"is as you choose. I used manifold paper to have a copy of what I sent. It was not written as news, for it is incredible, but as fiction. It may go as a part of my testimony under oath."
"But you say it is incredible."
"That is nothing to you, sir, if I also swear that it is true."
The coroner was apparently not greatly affected by the young man's manifest resentment. He was silent for some moments, his eyes upon the floor. The men about the sides of the cabin talked in whispers. but seldom withdrew their gaze from the face of the corpse. Presently, the coroner lifted his eyes and said,
"We will resume the inquest."
The men removed their hats. The witness was sworn.
"What is your name?"
The coroner asked.
William Harker,
Age?
27.
You knew the deceased, Hugh Morgan.
Yes,
You were with him when he died?
near him.
How did that happen? Your presence, I mean.
I was visiting him at this place to shoot and fish. A part of my purpose, however, was to study him and his odd, solitary way of life. He seemed a good model for a character in fiction. I sometimes write stories.
I sometimes read them.
Thank you.
Stories in general, not yours.
Some of the jurors laughed. Against a somber background, humor shows highlights. Soldiers in the intervals of battle laugh easily, and a jest in the death chamber conquers by surprise.
Relate the circumstances of this man's death,
said the coroner.
You may use any notes or memoranda that you please.
The witness understood. Pulling a manuscript from his breast pocket, he held it near the candle, and turning the leaves until he found the passage that he wanted, began to read.
The sun had hardly risen when we left the house. We were looking for quail, each with a shotgun, but we only had one dog. Morgan said that our best ground was beyond a certain ridge that he pointed out, and we crossed it by trail through the chaparral. On the other side was comparatively level ground, thickly covered with wild oats. As we emerged from the chaparral, Morgan was but a few yards in advance. Suddenly we heard, at a little distance to our right and partly in front, a noise as of some animal thrashing about in the bushes, which we could see were violently agitated. "We've started a deer,"
said he.
"I wish we had brought a rifle." Morgan, who had stopped and was intently watching the agitated chaparral, said nothing, but he had cocked both barrels of his gun and was holding it in readiness to aim. I thought him a trifle excited, which surprised me, for he had a reputation for exceptional coolness, even in moments of sudden and imminent peril. "Oh, come," I said. "You're not going to fill up a deer with quail shot, are you?" Still, he did not reply, but catching a sight of his face as he turned it slightly towards me, I was struck by the pallor of it. Then I understood that we had serious business on hand, and my first conjecture was that we had jumped a grizzly. I advanced to Morgan's side, cooking my piece as I moved. The bushes were now quiet, and the sounds had ceased, but Morgan was as attentive to the place as before. "What was it? What the devil is it?" I asked.
"The damned thing,"
he replied, without turning his head. His voice was husky and unnatural. He trembled visibly. I was about to speak further when I observed the wild oats near the place of the disturbance moving in the most inexplicable way. I can hardly describe it. It seems as if stirred by a streak of wind, which not only bent it, but pressed it down, crushed it so that it did not rise. And this movement was slowly prolonging itself directly towards us. Nothing that I had ever seen had affected me so strangely as this unfamiliar and unaccountable phenomenon. Yet I'm unable to recall any sense of fear. I remember, and tell it here because singularly enough, I recollected it then, that once, in looking carelessly out of an open window. I momentarily mistook a small tree close at hand for one of a group of larger trees at a little distance away. It looked the same size as the others, but being more distinctly and sharply defined in mass and detail, seemed out of harmony with them. It was a mere falsification of the law of aerial perspective, but it startled, almost terrified me. We so rely upon the orderly operation of familiar natural laws that any seeming suspension of them is noted as a menace to our safety, a warning of unthinkable calamity. So now the apparently causeless movement of the herbage and the slow, undeviating approach of the line of disturbance were distinctly disquieting. My companion appeared actually frightened, and I could hardly credit my senses when I saw him suddenly throw his gun to his shoulders and fire both barrels at the agitated grass. Before the smoke of the discharge had cleared away, I heard a loud, savage cry, a scream like that of a wild animal, and flinging his gun upon the ground, Morgan sprang away and ran swiftly from the spot. At the same instant, I was thrown violently to the ground by the impact of something unseen in the smoke, some soft, heavy substance that seemed thrown against me with great force. Before I could get upon my feet and recover my gun, which seemed to have been struck from my hands, I heard Morgan crying out, as if in mortal agony, and mingling with his cries were such hoarse, savage sounds as one hears from fighting dogs. Inexpressibly terrified, I struggled to my feet and looked in the direction of Morgan's retreat. And may heaven, in mercy, spare me from another sight like that. At a distance of less than 30 yards was my friend, down upon one knee, his head thrown back at a frightful angle, hatless, his long hair in disorder, and his whole body in violent movement from side to side, backward, forward. His right arm was lifted and seemed to lack the hand, at least. I could see none. The other arm was invisible. At times, as my memory now reports this extraordinary scene, I could discern but a part of his body. It was as if he had been partly blotted out. I cannot otherwise express it. Then a shifting of his position would bring it all into view again. All of this must have occurred within a few seconds, yet in that time Morgan assumed all the postures of a determined wrestler vanquished by a superior weight and strength. I saw nothing but him, and him not always distinctly. During the entire incident, his shouts and curses were heard, as if through an enveloping uproar of such sounds of rage and fury as I had never heard from the throat of a man or brute. For a moment I only stood irresolute. Then, throwing down my gun, I ran forward to my friend's assistance. I had a vague belief that he was suffering from a fit, some form of convulsion. Before I could reach his side, he was down and quiet. All sounds had ceased. But the feeling of such terror, as even these awful events had not inspired, I now saw the same mysterious movement of the wild oats, prolonging itself from the trampled area about the prostrate man towards the edge of a wood. It was only when it had reached the wood that I was able to withdraw my eyes and look at my companion. He was dead.
The coroner rose from his seat and stood beside the dead man. Lifting an edge of the sheet, he pulled it away, exposing the entire body, altogether naked and showing in the candlelight a clay-like yellow. It had, however, broad maculations of bluish-black, obviously caused by extravasated blood from contusions. The chest and sides looked as if they'd been beaten with a bludgeon. They were dreadful lacerations. The skin was torn in strips and shreds. The coroner moved round to the end of the table and undid a silk handkerchief, which had been passed under the chin, and knotted on the top of the head. When the handkerchief was drawn away, it exposed what had been the throat. Some of the jurors who had risen to get a better view repented their curiosity and turned away their faces. Witness Harker went to the open window and leaned out across the sill, faint and sick. Dropping the handkerchief upon the dead man's neck, the coroner stepped to an angle of the room, and from a pile of clothing produced one garment after another, each of which he held up for a moment for inspection. All were torn and stiff with blood. The jurors did not make a closer inspection. They seemed rather uninterested. They had, in truth, seen all this before, the only thing that was new to them being Harker's testimony.
Gentlemen,
the coroner said,
we have no more evidence, I think. Your duty has been already explained to you. If there's nothing you wish to ask, you may go outside and consider your verdict.
The foreman rose. a tall bearded man of 60, coarsely clad.
I should like to ask one question, Mr. Coroner,
he said.
What asylum did this year last witness escape from?
Mr. Harker,
said the coroner, gravely and tranquilly.
From what asylum did you last escape?
Harker flushed crimson again, but said nothing, and the 7 jurors rose and solemnly filed out of the cabin.
If you've done insulting me, sir,
said Harker, as soon as he and the officer were left alone with the dead man.
I suppose I am at liberty to go.
Yes.
Harker started to leave, but paused, with his hand on the door latch. The habit of his profession was strong in him, stronger than his sense of personal dignity. He turned about and said,
The book that you have there. I recognize it as Morgan's diary. You seemed greatly interested in it. You read in it while I was testifying. May I see it? The public would like...
The book will cut no figure in this matter,
replied the official, slipping it into his coat pocket.
All of the entries in it were made before the writer's death.
As Harker passed out of the house, the jury re-entered and stood about the table on which the now covered corpse showed under the sheet with sharp definition. The foreman seated himself near the candle, produced from his breast pocket a pencil and scrap of paper, and wrote rather laboriously the following verdict, which with varying degrees of effort all signed.
We, the jury, do find that the remains come to their death at the hands of a mountain lion. But some of us thinks, all the same, they had fits.
In the diary of the late Hugh Morgan are certain interesting entries having possibly a scientific value as suggestions. At the inquest upon his body, the book was not put into evidence. Possibly the coroner thought it was not worth the while to confuse the jury. The date of the first of the entries mentioned cannot be ascertained. The upper part of the leaf is torn away. The part of the entry remaining is as follows.
Would run in a half circle, keeping his head turned always towards the center. And again he would stand still, barking furiously. At last he ran away into the brush as fast as he could go. I thought it at first that he had gone mad, but upon returning to the house, found no other alteration in his manner than what was obviously due to fear of punishment. Can a dog see with his nose? Do odors impress some olfactory center with images of things emitting them? September 2nd. Looking at the stars last night as they rose above the crest of the ridge east of the house, I observed them successfully disappear from left to right. Each was eclipsed but an instant, and only a few at the same time. But along the entire length of the ridge, all that were within a degree or two of the crest were blotted out. It was as if something had passed along between me and them, but I could not see it, and the stars were not thick enough to define its outline. Ugh, I don't like this.
Several weeks' entries are missing, 3 leaves being torn from the book.
September 27. It has been about here again. I find evidences of its presence every day. I watched again all of last night in the same cover, gun in hand, double charged with buckshot. In the morning the fresh footprints were there, as before, yet I would have sworn that I did not sleep. Indeed, I hardly sleep at all. It is terrible, insupportable. If these amazing experiences are real, I shall go mad. If they are fanciful, I am mad already. October 3rd. I shall not go. It shall not drive me away. No, this is my house, my land. God hates a coward. October 5th. I can stand it no longer. I've invited Harker to pass a few weeks with me. He has a level head. I can judge from his manner if he thinks me mad. October 7th. I have the solution of the problems. It came to me last night, suddenly, as by revelation. How simple. How terribly simple.
There are sounds that we cannot hear. At either end of the scale are notes that stir no chord of the imperfect instrument, the human ear. They are too high or too grave. I've observed a flock of blackbirds occupying an entire treetop, the tops of several trees, and all in full song. Suddenly, in a moment, at absolutely the same instant, all spring into the air and fly away. How? They could not see one another. Whole treetops intervened. At no point could a leader have been visible to all. There must have been a signal of warning or command high and shrill above the din, but by me unheard. I have observed too the same simultaneous flight when all were silent, among not only blackbirds, but other birds, quail, for example, widely separated by bushes, even on opposite sides of a hill. It is known to seamen that a school of whales basking or sporting on the surface of the ocean, miles apart, with the convexity of the earth between them, will sometimes dive at the same instant, all gone out of sight in a moment. The signal has been sounded. Too grave for the ear of the sailor at the masthead and his comrades on the deck, who nevertheless feels its vibrations in the ship as the stones of a cathedral are stirred by the bass of the organ. As with sounds, so with colors. At each end of the solar spectrum, the chemist can detect the presence of what are known as actinic rays. They represent colors, integral colors in the composition of light, which we are unable to discern. The human eye is an imperfect instrument. Its range is but a few octaves of the real chromatic scale. I am not mad. There are colors that we cannot see. And God help me, the damned thing is of such a color.
Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake so the gas didn't kill them, since it was toxic in high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so they had only microphones in a 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized window in the chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on but no bedding, running water and toilet, and enough dried food to last all 5 for over a month. The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised, falsely, that they would be freed if they submitted to the test and did not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past, and the general tone of their conversation took on a darker aspect after the 4-day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that led them to where they were, and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternately whispering to the microphones and one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity with them. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran for the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about this behavior is how the other captives reacted to it, or rather, didn't react to it. They continued whispering to the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. The two non-screaming captives took the books apart, smeared page after page with their own feces, and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes. The screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering to the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure they were working, since they thought it's impossible that no sound could be coming with 5 people inside. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a very heavy level of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something they said they would not do to get a reaction from the captives. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the captives they were afraid were either dead or vegetables. They announced,
"We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom."
To their surprise, they heard a single phrase in a calm voice response.
"We no longer want to be freed."
Debate broke out among the researchers and the military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any more response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately voices from the microphones began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for the life of loved ones to turn the gas back on. The chamber was opened and soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subject. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state that any of them were in as life. The food rations past day 5 had not been so much as touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subject's thighs and chest stuffed into the drain in the center of the chamber, blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was actually blood was never determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth as the researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the position and angles of the wounds indicated that most, if not all of them, were self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the ribcage of all 4 test subjects had been removed. While the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place, the skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the ribcage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tract of all 4 could be seen to be working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that what they were digesting was their own flesh, that they had ripped off and eaten over the course of days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left in the chamber, and alternately begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives, if you count ones that committed suicide in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured, and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this was proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of a morphine derivative and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arm of one doctor. When heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he had bled out to the point there was more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach and just repeating the words, "more," over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent.
The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begged for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative they had given him to prepare him for surgery. He had fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought out to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, even through the weight of a 200-pound soldier holding that wrist as well. It took only a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had tripled the normal level of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in a struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force his own muscles had exerted on them. The second survivor had been the first of the group of 5 to start screaming. His vocal cords destroyed, he was unable to beg or object to the surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when someone suggested reluctantly they try the surgery without anesthetic, and did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should be medically impossible for the patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming this must be something of drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so the patient could write his message. It was simple. Keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well, although they had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation. The surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation while the patient laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were asking again for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given.
I must remain awake.
All 3 subjects' restraints were reinforced and they were placed back into the chamber, awaiting determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. The commanding officer, an ex-KGB, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all 3 stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going back on the gas. It was obvious that at this point all 3 were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all his might, first left, then right, then left again for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired for EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves in surprise. They were normal most of the time, but sometimes flatlined inexplicably. It looked as if he were repeatedly suffering brain death before returning to normal. As they focused on paper scrolling at the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut at the moment his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwaves showed the same flat lines as one who had just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as 3 researchers. One of the named 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room.
I won't be locked in here with these things! Not with you!
He screamed at the man strapped to the table.
What are you?
He demanded.
I must know.
The subject smiled.
Have you forgotten so easily?
The subject asked.
We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are you, hide from in your beds every night. We are you, sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to nocturnal haven where we cannot tread.
The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out.
So nearly free.
When Stone reached the fairground, having been misdirected twice, he thought it looked more like a gigantic amusement arcade. A couple of paper cups tumbled and rattled on the shore beneath the promenade, and the cold, insinuating October wind scooped the Mersey across the slabs of red rock that formed the beach. Across the broken bottles and abandoned tires, beneath the stubby white mock turrets of the long fairground facade, shops displayed souvenirs and fish and chips. Among them, in the fairground entrances, scraps of paper world. Stone almost walked away. This wasn't his best holiday. One fairground in Wales had been closed, and this one certainly wasn't what he'd expected. The guidebook had made it sound like a genuine fairground. Sideshows you must stride among, not looking in case their barkers lured you in. The sudden shock of waterfalls cascading down what looked like painted cardboard. The shots and bells and wooden concussions of target galleries. The girls' shrieks overhead. The slippery armor and juicy crunch of toffee apples. The illumination springing alight against the darkening sky. But at least, he thought, he had chosen his time well. If he went in now, he might have the fairground almost to himself. As he reached an entrance, he saw his mother eating fish and chips from a paper tray. What nonsense! She would never have eaten standing up in public. Like a horse, as she used to say. But he watched as she hurried out of the shop, face averted from him and the wind. Of course, it had been the way she ate, with little snatching motions of her fork and mouth. He pushed the incident to the side of his mind in hope that it would fall away, and hurried through the entrance, into the clamor of color and noise. The high roof with its bare iron girders reminded him at once of a railway station, but the place was noisier still. The uproar, the echoing sirens and jets and dangerous groaning of metal, was trapped and was deafening. It was so overwhelming that he had to remind himself he could see, even if he couldn't hear. But there wasn't much to see. The machines looked faded and dusty. Cars, like huge armchairs, were lurching and spinning helplessly along a switchback. A canvas canopy was closing over an endless parade of seats. A great disc tasseled with seats was lifting towards the roof, dangling a lone couple over its gears. With so few people in sight, it seemed almost that the machines, frustrated by inaction, were operating themselves. For a moment, Stone had the impression of being shut in dusty rooms where the toys, as in childhood tales, had come to life. He shrugged vaguely and turned to leave. Perhaps he could drive to the fairground at Southport, though it was a good few miles across the Mersey. His holiday was dwindling rapidly. He wondered how they were managing at the tax office in his absence. Slower than usual, no doubt. Then he saw the merry-go-round. It was a toy, forgotten by another child and left here, or handed down the generations. Beneath its ornate scrolled canopy, the horses rode on poles, towards their reflections in a ring of mirrors. The horses were white wood or wood painted white, their bodies dappled with purple, red, and green, and some of their sketched faces, too. On the hub, above a notice, "Made in Amsterdam," an organ piped to itself. Around it, Stone saw carved fish, mermen, zephyrs, a head and shoulders smoking a pipe in a frame, a landscape of hills and lake, an unfurling perched hawk. "Oh, yes," Stone said. As he clambered onto the platform, he felt a hint of embarrassment, but nobody seemed to be watching.
"Can you pay me?"
said the head in the frame.
"My boy's gone for a minute."
The man's hair was the color of the smoke from his pipe. His lips puckered on the stem and smiled. "It's a merry-go-round," Stone said.
"You know about them, do you?"
"Well, a little." The man looked disappointed, and Stone hurried on. "I know a lot of fairgrounds. They're my holiday, you see, every year. Each year I cover a different area. I may write a book." The idea had occasionally tempted him, but he hadn't taken notes, and he still had 10 years to retirement, for which the book had suggested itself as an activity.
"You go alone, every year?"
"It has its merits. Less expensive, for one thing. Helps me save. Before I retire, I mean to see Disneyland in Vienna." He thought of the big wheel, hairy lime, the earth falling away beneath. "I'll get on," he said. He patted the unyielding shoulders of the horse and remembered a childhood friend who'd had a rocking horse in his bedroom. Stone had ridden it a few times, more and more wildly when it was nearly time to go home. His friend's bedroom was brighter than his, and as he clung to the wooden shoulders, he was clutching the friendly room, too. Funny thinking of that now, he thought, because I haven't been on a merry-go-round for years, I suppose. The merry-go-round stirred, the horse lifted him, let him sink. As they moved forward, slowly gathering momentum, Stone saw a crowd surging through one of the entrances and spreading through the funfair. He grimaced. It had been his fairground for a little while. They needn't have arrived just as he was enjoying his merry-go-round. The crowd swung away. A jangle of pinball machines sailed by. Amid the dodgems, a giant with a barrel body was spinning, flapping its limp arms. A red electric cigar thrust in its blank grin, and throbbing in time with its slow, thick laughter. A tinny voice read bingo numbers, buzzing indistinctly. Perhaps it was because he hadn't eaten for a while, saving himself for the toffee apples. But he was growing dizzy. It felt like the whirling, blurred shot of the fair in Saturday night and Sunday morning. A fair he hadn't liked because it was too grim. Give him strangers on a train. Some came running. The third man. Even the fairground murder and horrors of the Black Museum. He shook his head to try to control his pouring thoughts. But the fair was spinning faster. The ghost train station raced by, howling and screaming. People strolling past the merry-go-round looked jerky as drawings in a thaumatrope. Here came the ghost train once more, and Stone glimpsed the queue beneath the beckoning green corpse. They were staring at him. No, he realized next time around. They were staring at the merry-go-round. He was just something that kept appearing as they watched. At the end of the queue, staring and poking around inside his nostrils, stood Stone's father. Stone gripped the horse's neck as he began to fall. The man was already wandering away towards the dodgems. Why was his mind so traitorous today? It wouldn't be so bad if the comparisons it made weren't so repulsive.
why he'd never met a man or woman to compare with his parents. Admired people, yes, but not in the same way. Not since the 2 polished boxes had been lowered into holes and hidden. Noise and color spun about him and inside him. Why wasn't he allowing himself to think about his parents' death? He knew why he was blocking. And that should be his salvation. At the age of 10, he'd suffered death and hell every night. He clung to the wood in the whirlpool and remembered. His father had denied him a nightlight, and his mother had nodded, saying, "Yes, I think it's time." He'd lain in bed, terrified to move in case he betrayed his presence to the darkness, mouthing, "Please, God, don't let it," over and over. He lay so that he could see the faint gray vertical line of the window between the curtains in the far distance, but even that light seemed to be receding. He knew that death and hell would be like this. Sometimes, as he began to blur with sleep, and the room grew larger and shapes dark against the darkness awoke. He couldn't tell that he hadn't already died. He sat back as the horse slowed, and he began to slip forward across its neck. What then? Eventually, he'd seen through the self-perpetuating trap of religious guilt, of hell, of not daring to believe in it because then it would get you. For a while, he'd been vaguely uneasy in dark places, but not sufficiently so to track down the feeling and conquer it. After a while, it had dissipated, along with his parents' overt disapproval of his atheism. Yes, he thought as his memories in the merry-go-round slowed. I was happiest then, lying in bed, hearing and feeling them in the house around me. Then, when he was 30, a telephone call had summoned him to the hole in the road, to the site of the car, like a dead black beetle protruding from the hole. There had been a moment of sheer, vertiginous terror, and then it was over. His parents had gone into darkness. That was enough. It was the one almost religious observance he imposed on himself. Think no more. And there was no reason to do so now. He staggered away from the merry-go-round towards the pinball arcade that occupied most of one side of the fun fair. He remembered how, when he lay mouthing soundless pleas in bed, he would sometimes stop and think of what he'd read about dreams, that they might last for hours, but in reality occupied only a split second. Was the same true of thoughts? And prayers, when you had nothing but darkness by which to tell the time? Besides defending him, his prayers were counting off the moments before dawn. Perhaps he had used up only a minute, only a second of darkness. Death and hell. What strange ideas I used to have, he thought, especially for a 10-year-old. I wonder where they went. Away with short trousers and pimples and everything else I grew out of course. 3 boys of about 12 were crowded around a pinball machine. As they moved apart momentarily, he saw that they were trying to start it with a coin on a piece of wire. He took a stride towards them and opened his mouth. But suppose they turned on him? If they set about him, pulled him down and kicked him, his shouts would never be heard for the uproar. There was no sign of an attendant. Stone hurried back to the merry-go-round, where several little girls were mounting horses.
Those boys they're up to no good,
he complained to the man in the frame.
You! Yes, you! I've seen you before! Don't let me see you again!
The man shouted. They dispersed, swaggering.
Things didn't used to be like this,
he said, breathing hard with relief.
I suppose your merry-go-round is all that's left of the old fairground.
The old one? No, this didn't come from there.
I thought the old one must have been taken over.
No, still there, what's left of it.
The man said.
I don't know what you'd find there now. Through there's your quickest way. You'll come to the side entrance in 5 minutes, if it's still open.
The moon had risen. It glided along the rooftops as Stone emerged from the back of the fun fair and hurried along the terraced street. Its light lingered on the tips of chimneys and the peaks of roofs, inside the houses, above slivers of earth or stone that passed for front gardens.
Stone saw faces silvered by television. At the end of the terrace, beyond a wider road, he saw an identical street paralleled by an alley. Just keep going. The moon cleared the roofs as he crossed the intersection and left a whitish patch on his vision. He was trying to blink it away as he reached the street, and so he wasn't certain if he glimpsed a group of boys emerging from the street he'd just left and running into the alley. Anxiety hurried him onwards, while he wondered if he should turn back. His car was on the promenade. He could reach it in 5 minutes. They must be the boys he had seen in the pinball arcade, out for revenge. Quite possibly they had knives or broken bottles. No doubt they knew how to use them from the television. His heels clacked in the silence. Dark exits from the alley gaped between the houses. He tried to set his feet down gently as he ran. The boys were making no sound at all, at least none that reached him. If they managed to overbalance him, they could smash his bones while he struggled to rise. At his age, that could be worse than dangerous. Another exit lurked between the houses, which looked threatening in their weight and impassivity. He must stay on his feet whatever happened. If the boys got hold of his arms, he could only shout for help. The houses fell back as the street curved. Their opposite numbers loomed closer. In front of him, beyond a wall of corrugated tin, lay the old fairground. He halted, panting, trying to quell his breath before it blotted out any sounds in the alley, where he had hoped to find a well-lit road to the promenade. Both sides of the street ended as if lopped, and the way was blocked by a wall of tin. In the middle, however, the tin had been prized back like a lid, and a jagged entrance yawned among the sharp shadows and moonlit inscriptions. The fairground was closed and deserted. As he realized that the last exit was back beyond the curve of the street, Stone stepped through the gap in the tin. He stared down the street, which was empty but for scattered fragments of brick and glass. It occurred to him that they might not have been the same boys after all. He pulled the tin to behind him and looked around. The circular booths, the long target galleries, the low roller coaster, the arc in the crazy house, draped shadow over each other, emerged with the dimness of the paths between. Even the merry-go-round was hooded by darkness hanging from its canopy. Such wood as he could see in the moonlight looked ragged, the paint patchy, but between the silent machines and stalls, one ride was faintly illuminated. The ghost train. He walked towards it. Its front was emitting a pale green glow which at first sight looked like moonlight, but which was brighter than the white tinge the moon imparted to the adjoining rides. Stone could see one car on the rails, close to the entrance of the ride. As he approached, he glimpsed from the corner of his eye a group of men, stall holders presumably, talking and gesticulating in the shadows between two stalls. So the fairground wasn't entirely deserted. They might be about to close, but perhaps they would allow him one ride. Seeing that the ghost train was still lit, he hoped they hadn't seen him using the vandal's entrance. As he reached the ride and realized that the glow came from a coat of luminous paint, liberally applied but now rather dull and threadbare, he heard a loud clang from the tin wall. It might have been someone throwing a brick, or someone reopening the torn door. The stalls obstructed his view. He glanced quickly about for another exit, but found none. He might run into a dead end. It was best to stay where he was. He couldn't trust the stall holders. They might live nearby. They might know the boys, or even be their parents. As a child, he'd once run to someone who had proved to be his attacker's unhelpful father. He climbed into the ghost train car. Nothing happened. Nobody was attending the ride. Stone strained his ears. Neither the boys, if they were there, nor the attendants seemed to be approaching. If he called out, the boys would hear him. Instead, frustrated and furious, he began to kick the metal inside the nose of the car. Immediately, the car trundled forward over the lip of an incline in the track and plunged
through the ghost train doors into darkness. As he swung round an unseen clattering curve, surrounded by noise in the dark, Stone felt as if he had suddenly become the victim of delirium. He remembered his storm-racked childhood bed and the teeming darkness pouring into him. Why on earth had he come on this ride? He never liked ghost trains as a child, and as he grew up he had instinctively avoided them. He'd allowed his panic to trap him. The boys might be waiting when he emerged. Well, in that case, he would appeal to whoever was operating the ride. He sat back, gripping the wooden seat beneath him with both hands, and gave himself up to the straining of metal, the abrupt swoops of the car, and the darkness. Then, as his anxiety about the outcome of the ride diminished, another impression began to trickle back. As the car had swung around the first curve, he'd glimpsed an illuminated shape. 2 illuminated shapes, withdrawn so swiftly that he'd had no time to glance up at them. He had the impression that they had been the faces of a man and a woman, gazing down at him. At once they had vanished into darkness, or been swept away by it. It seemed to him, for some reason, very important to remember their expressions. Before he could pursue this, he saw a grayish glow ahead of him. He felt an unreasoning hope that it would be a window, which might give him an idea of the extent of the darkness. But already, he could see that its shape was too irregular. A little closer and he could make it out. It was a large, stuffed gray rabbit with huge glass or plastic eyes, squatting upright in an alcove with its front paws extended before it. Not a dead rabbit, of course. A toy. Beneath him, the car was clattering and shaking. Yet he had the odd notion that this was a deliberate effect. That in fact the car had halted, and the rabbit was approaching, or growing. Rubbish, he thought. It was a pretty feeble ghost anyway. Childish. His hands pulled at the splinters on the wooden seat beneath him. The rabbit rushed towards him as the track descended a slight slope. One of its eyes was loose, and whitish stuffing hung down its cheek from the hole. The rabbit was at least 4 feet tall. As the car almost collided with it before whipping away around a curve, the rabbit toppled towards him, and the light that illuminated it went out. Stone gasped and clutched his chest. He twisted round to look behind him at the darkness, where he judged the rabbit to have been, until a spasm wrenched him frontward again. Light tickling drifted over his face. He shuddered, then relaxed. Of course they always had threads hanging down for cobwebs. His friends had told him that. But no wonder the fairground was deserted, if this was the best they could do. Giant toys lit up, indeed. Not only cheap, but liable to give children nightmares. The car coursed up a slight incline and down again, before shaking itself in a frenzy around several curves. Trying to soften you up before the next shock, Stone thought. Not me, thank you very much. He lay back in his seat and sighed loudly with boredom. The sound hung on his ears like muffs. Why did I do that? He wondered. It's not as if the operator can hear me. Then who can? Having spent its energy on the curves, the car was slowing. Stone peered ahead, trying to anticipate. Obviously, he was meant to relax before the car startled him with a sudden jerk. As he peered, he found his eyes were adjusting to the darkness. At least he could make out a few feet ahead. At the side of the track, a squat and bulky gray shape. He squinted as the car coasted towards it. It was a large armchair. The car came abreast of it and halted. Stone peered at the chair. In the dim, hectic flecked light, which seemed to attract and outline all the restless discs on his eyes, the chair somehow looked larger than he. Perhaps it was farther away than he'd thought. Some clothes thrown over the back of the chair looked diminished by it, but they could be child's clothes. If nothing else, Stone thought.
It's instructive to watch my mind working. Now, let's get on. Then he noticed the almost invisible light was flickering. Either that, which was possible, although he couldn't determine the source of the light, or the clothes were shifting, very gradually but nonetheless definitely, as if something hidden by them was lifting them to peer out, perhaps preparatory to emerging. Stone leaned towards the chair. Let's see what it is. Let's get it over with. But the light was far too dim, the chair too distant. Probably he would be unable to see it when it emerged, the way the light had been allowed to run down, unless he left the car and went closer. He had one hand on the side of the car when he realized that if the car moved off while he was out of it, he would be left to grope his way through the darkness. He slumped back, and as he did so, glimpsed a violent movement among the clothes near the seat of the chair. He glanced towards it. Before his eyes could focus, the dim gray light was extinguished. Stone sat for a moment, all of him concentrating on the silence, the blind darkness. Then he began to kick frantically at the nose of the car. The car shook a little with his attack, but stayed where it was. By the time it decided to move forward, the pressure of his blood seemed to be turning the darkness red. When the car nosed its way around the next curve, slowing as if sniffing the track ahead, Stone heard a muted thud and creak of wood above the noise of the wheels. It came from in front of him. The sort of thing you hear in a house at night, he thought. Soon be out now. Without warning, a face came rushing towards him out of the darkness, a few feet ahead. It jerked forward as he did. Of course it would, he thought with a grimace, sinking back and watching his face sink briefly into the mirror. Now he could see that he and the car were surrounded by a faint light that extended as far as the wooden frame of the mirror. Must be the end of the ride. They can't get any more obvious than that. Effective in its way, I suppose. He watched himself in the mirror as the car followed the curve past. His silhouette loomed on the grayish light, which had fallen behind. Suddenly he frowned. His silhouette was moving independent of the movement of the car. It was beginning to swing out of the limits of the mirror. Then he remembered the wardrobe that had stood at the foot of his childhood bed, and realized what was happening. The mirror was set in a door, which was opening. Stone pressed himself against the opposite side of the car, which had slowed almost to a halt. No, he thought. It mustn't. Don't! He heard a grinding of gears beneath him. Unmeshed metal shrieked. He threw his body forward against the nose of the car. In the darkness to his left, he heard the creak of the door and a soft thud. The car moved a little, then caught the gears and ground forward. As a light went out behind him, Stone felt a weight fall beside him on the seat. He cried out, or tried to, for as he gulped in air it seemed to draw darkness into his lungs. Darkness that swelled and poured into his heart and brain. There was a moment in which he knew nothing, as if he'd become darkness and silence and the memory of suffering. Then the car was rattling on. The darkness was sweeping over him and by, and the nose of the car banged open the doors and plunged out into the night. As the car swung onto the length of track outside the ghost train, Stone caught sight of the gap between the stalls, where he had thought he'd seen the stall holders. A welling moonlight showed him that between the stalls stood a pile of sacks, nodding and gesticulating in the wind. Then from the seat behind him, emerged from the shadow, and he looked down. Next to him on the seat was a shrunken hooded figure. It wore a faded jacket and trousers, striped and patched in various colors, indistinguishable
in the receding moonlight. The head almost reached his shoulder. Its arms hung slack at its sides, and its feet drummed laxly on the metal beneath the seat. Shrinking away, Stone reached for the front of the car to pull himself to his feet, and the figure's head fell back. Stone closed his eyes. When he opened them, he saw within the hood an oval of white cloth upon which black crosses for eyes, a barred crescent for a mouth, a grinning face was stitched. As he suddenly realized that the car hadn't halted nor even slowed before plunging down the incline, back into the ghost train, Stone did not immediately notice that the figure had taken his hand.
Unhappy is he, to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon lone hours in vast and dismal chambers with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon odd watches in twilight groves of grotesque, gigantic, and vine-encumbered trees that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot the gods gave to me, the dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken. Yet I am strangely content, and cling desperately to those sear memories, when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond to the other. I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages, and having high ceilings where the eye could not find only cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridors seemed always hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell everywhere, as of the piled-up corpses of dead generations. It was never light, so that I used to sometimes light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief. Nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high above the topmost accessible tower. There was one black tower which reached above the trees into the unknown outer sky. That was partly ruined, could not be ascended save by a well-nigh impossible climb up the sheer wall, stone by stone. I must have lived years in this place, but I cannot measure the time. Beings must have cared for my needs, yet I cannot recall any person except myself, or anything alive, but the noiseless rats and bats and spiders. I think that whoever nursed me must have been shockingly aged, since my first conception of a living person was that of something mockingly like myself, yet distorted, shriveled, and decaying like the castle. To me, there was nothing grotesque in the bones and skeletons that strode some of the stone crypts deep down among the foundations. I fantastically associated these things with everyday events, and thought them more natural than the coloured pictures of living beings which I found many of the mouldy books. From such books, I learned all that I know. No teacher urged or guided me, and I do not recall hearing any human voices in all those years, not even my own. For although I had read of speech, I'd never thought to try to speak aloud. My aspect was a matter equally unthought of, for there were no mirrors in the castle, and I merely regarded myself by instinct as akin to the youthful figures I saw drawn and painted in the books. I felt conscious of youth because I remembered so little. Outside, across the putrid moat and under the dark mute trees, I would often lie and dream for hours about what I read in the books, would longingly picture myself amidst gay crowds in the sunny world beyond the endless forest. Once, I tried to escape from the forest, but as I went farther from the castle, the shade grew denser and the air more filled with brooding fear, so that I ran back frantically, back lest I lose my way in a labyrinth of nighted silence. So though endless twilights I dreamed and waited, though I knew not what I waited for, then in shadowy solitude, my longing for light grew so frantic that I could rest no more. And I lifted entreating hands to the single black ruined tower that reached above the forest into the unknown outer sky. And at last, I resolved to scale that tower, fall though I might, since it were better to glimpse the sky and perish than to live without ever beholding day. In the dank twilight, I climbed the worn and aged stone stairs till I reached the level where they ceased, and thereafter clung perilously to small footholds leading upward. Ghastly and terrible was that dead, stareless cylinder of rock, black, ruined and deserted, and sinister with startled bats whose wings made no noise. But more ghastly and terrible still was the slowness of my progress, for climb as I might, the darkness overhead grew no thinner, and a new chill, as if haunted and venerable mold assailed me. I shivered as I wondered why I did not reach into the light, and would have looked down had I dared. I fancy that night comes suddenly upon me, vainly grope with one free hand for a window embrasure, that I might peer out and above, and to try to judge the height I had attained. All at once, after an infinity of awesome, sightless crawling up that concave and desperate precipice, I felt my head touch a solid thing, and I knew I must have gained the roof, or at least some kind of floor. In the darkness, I raised my free hand and tested the barrier, finding it stone and immovable. There came a deadly circuit of the tower, clinging to whatever holds a slimy wall could give, till finally my testing hand found the barrier yielding, and I turned upward again, pushing the slab of door with my head as I used both hands in my fearful ascent. There was no light revealed above. As my hands went higher, I knew that my climb was for the nonce ended, since the slab was the trapdoor of an aperture leading to a level stone surface of greater circumference than the lower tower. Now doubt the floor as some lofty and capacious observation tower. I crawled through carefully, tried to prevent the heavy slab from falling back into place, but failed in the latter attempt. As I lay exhausted on the stone floor, I hear the eerie echoes of its fall, but hope when necessary to pry it open again. Believing I was now at a prodigious height, far above the accursed branches of the wood, I dragged myself up from the floor and fumbled about for windows, that I might look for the first time upon the sky, and the moon, and the stars of which I had read. But in every hand I was disappointed, since all I found were vast shelves of marble, bearing odious oblong boxes of disturbing size. More and more I reflected. I wondered what hoary secrets might abide in this high apartment, so many eons cut off from the castle below. Then unexpectedly my hands came upon a doorway, where hung a portal of stone, rough with strange chiseling. Trying it, I found it locked, but with a supreme burst of strength, I overcame all obstacles, dragged it open inward. As I did so, it came to me the purest ecstasy I've ever known. For shining tranquilly through an ornate grating of iron and down a short stone passageway of steps that ascended from the newly found doorway was the radiant full moon, which I'd never seen save in dreams and in vague visions I dare not call memories. Fancying now that I'd attained the very pinnacle of the castle, I commenced to rush up the few steps beyond the door, but the sudden veiling of the moon by a cloud caused me to stumble, and I felt my way more slowly in the dark. It was still very dark when I reached the grating, which I tried carefully and found unlocked, but which I did not open for fear of falling from an amazing height to which I had climbed. Then the moon came out. Most demoniacal of all shocks is that of the abysmally unexpected and grotesquely unbelievable. Nothing I had before undergone would compare in terror with what I now saw, with the bizarre marvels that sight implied. The sight itself was as simple as it was stupefying, for it was merely this. Instead of a dizzying prospect of trees seen from a lofty eminence, there stretched around me on a level through the grating nothing less than solid ground, decked and diversified by marble slabs and columns, and overshadowed by an ancient stone church, whose ruined spire gleamed spectrally in the moonlight. Half unconscious, I opened the grating, staggered out upon the white gravel path that stretched away in two directions. My mind, stunned and chaotic as it was, still held the frantic craving for light, and not even the fantastic wonder which had happened could stay my course. I neither knew nor cared whether my experience was insanity, dreaming, or magic, but was determined to gaze on brilliance and gaiety at any cost. I knew not who I was, or what I was, or what my surroundings might be, though as I continued to stumble along, I became conscious of a kind of fearsome latent memory and made my progress not wholly fortuitous. I passed under an arch of that region of slabs and columns and wandered through an open country, sometimes following the visible road, sometimes leaving it curiously to tread across meadows where only occasional ruins bespoke the ancient presence of a forgotten road. Once I swam across the swift river where crumbling mossy masonry told of a bridge long vanished. Over 2 hours must have passed before I reached what seemed to be my goal, a venerable ivied castle in a thickly wooded park, maddeningly familiar, yet full of perplexing strangeness to me. I saw that the moat was filled in, and that some of the well-known towers were demolished, whilst new wings existed to confuse the beholder. But what I observed with chief interest and delight were open windows, gorgeously ablaze with light and sending forth sound of the gayest revelry. Advancing to one of these, I looked in, saw an oddly dressed company, indeed, making merry and speaking brightly to one another. I had never seemingly heard human speech before. I could guess only vaguely what was said. Some of the faces seemed to hold expressions that brought up incredibly remote recollections. Others were utterly alien. I now stepped through the low window into the brilliantly lighted room, stepping as I did so from my single bright moment of hope to my blackest convulsion of despair and realization. The nightmare was quick to come, for as I entered, there occurred immediately one of the most terrifying demonstrations I'd ever conceived. Scarcely had I crossed the sill when there descended upon me, the whole company, a sudden and unheralded fear of hideous intensity, distorting every face and evoking the most horrible screams from nearly every throat. Flight was universal, and in the clamour and panic several fell in a swoon and were dragged away by their madly fleeing companions. Many covered their eyes with their hands and plunged blindly and awkwardly in their race to escape, overturning furniture and stumbling against the walls before they managed to reach one of the many doors. The cries were shocking as I stood in the brilliant apartment alone and dazed, listening to their vanishing echoes. I trembled at the thought of what might be lurking near me unseen. At a casual inspection, the room seemed deserted, but when I moved towards one of the alcoves, I thought I detected a presence there. A hint of motion beyond the golden arched doorway leading to another and somewhat similar room. As I approached the arch, I began to perceive the presence more clearly. And then, with the first and last sound I ever uttered, a ghastly ululation that revolted me almost as pointedly as its noxious cause, I beheld in full, frightful vividness the inconceivable, indescribable, and unmentionable monstrosity, which had by its simple appearance changed a merry company to a herd of delirious fugitives. I cannot even hint what it was like, for it was a compound of all that is unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, and detestable. It was a ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity, and desolation, the putrid, dripping eidolon of unwholesome revelation, the awful bearing of that which the merciful earth should always hide. God knows it was not of this world, or no longer of this world. Yet, to my horror, I saw in its eaten away and bone-revealing outlines a leering, abhorrent travesty on the human shape, and its mouldy, disintegrating apparel, an unspeakable quality that chilled me even more. I was almost paralyzed, but not too much to make a feeble effort towards flight. A backward stumble which failed to break the spell in which the nameless, voiceless monster held me. My eyes, bewitched by the glassy orbs which stared loathsomely into them, refused to close, though they were mercifully blurred, and shewed the terrible object but indistinctly after the first shock. I tried to raise my hand to shut out their sight, yet so stunned were my nerves that my arm could not fully obey my will. The attempt, however, was enough to disturb my balance, so that I had to stagger forward several steps to avoid falling. As I did so, I became suddenly and agonizingly aware of the nearness of the carrion thing, whose hideous, hollow breathing I half fancied I could hear. Nearly mad, I found myself yet able to throw out a hand to ward off this fetid apparition which pressed so close, when in one cataclysmic second of cosmic nightmarishness and hellish accidents, my fingers touched the rotting outstretched paw of the monster beneath the golden arch. I did not shriek, but all the fiendish ghouls that ride the night wind shrieked for me as in that same second, then crashed down upon me in a single and fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory. I knew in that second all that had been. I remembered beyond the frightful castle and the trees, and recognized the altered edifice which I now stood. I recognized, most terrible of all, the unholy abomination that stood leering before me as I withdrew my sullied fingers from its own. But in the cosmos there is balm as well as bitterness, and that balm is nepenthe. In the supreme horror of that second, I forgot what had horrified me, and the burst of black memory vanished in a chaos of echoing images. In a dream, I fled from that haunted and accursed pile, ran swiftly and silently in the moonlight. When I returned to the churchyard place of marble, went down the steps, I found the stone trap door immovable, but I was not sorry, for I had hated the antique castle and the trees. Now I ride with mocking and friendly ghouls on the night wind, and play by day amongst the catacombs of Nephrin Kaw in the sealed and unknown valley of Hadoth by the Nile. I know that light is not for me, save the unnamed feast of Nitocris beneath the Great Pyramid. Yet in my new wildness and freedom, I almost welcome the bitterness of alienage. For although nepenthe has calmed me, I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century, and among those who are still men. This I've known ever since I stretched out my fingers to the abomination within that great gilded frame, stretching out my fingers and touched the cold and unyielding surface of polished glass.
Certain houses, like certain persons, manage somehow to proclaim at once their character for evil. In the case of the latter, no particular feature need betray them. They may boast an open countenance and an ingenious smile, and yet a little of their company leaves the unalterable conviction that there is something radically amiss with their being, that they are evil. Willy-nilly, they seem to communicate an atmosphere of secret and wicked thoughts which makes those in their immediate neighborhood shrink from them, as from a thing diseased. And, perhaps, with houses the same principle is operative. And it is the aroma of evil deeds committed under a particular roof long after the actual doers have passed away that makes the goose flesh come and their hair rise. Something of the original passion of the evildoer and of the horror felt by its victim enter the heart of the innocent watcher, and he becomes suddenly conscious of tingling nerves, creeping skin, and a chilling of the blood. He is terror-stricken without apparent cause. There was manifestly nothing in the external appearance of this particular house to bear out the tales of the horror that was said to reign within. It was neither lonely nor unkempt. It stood crowded into a corner of the square, and it looked exactly like the houses on either side of it. It had the same number of windows as its neighbor, the same balcony overlooking the gardens,
The same white steps leading up to the heavy black front door, and in the rear there was the same narrow strip of green, with neat box borders running up to the wall that divided it from the backs of the adjoining houses. Apparently, too, the number of chimney pots on the roof was the same, the breadth and angle of the eaves, and even the height of the dirty area railings. Yet this house in the square, that seemed precisely similar to its 50 ugly neighbors, was, as a matter of fact, entirely different. Horribly different. Wherein lay this marked invisible difference is impossible to say. It cannot be ascribed wholly to the imagination because persons who had spent some time in the house, knowing nothing of the facts, had declared positively that certain rooms were so disagreeable they would rather die than enter them again, and that the atmosphere of the whole house produced in them symptoms of genuine terror. While the series of innocent tenants who had tried to live in it and had been forced to decamp at the shortest possible notice was indeed little less than a scandal in the town. When Shorthouse arrived to pay a weekend visit to his Aunt Julia in her little house on the seafront at the other end of town, he found her charged to the brim with mystery and excitement. He had only received her telegram that morning, and he had come anticipating boredom, but the moment he touched her hand and kissed her apple skin wrinkled cheek, he caught the first wave of her electrical condition. The impression deepened when he learned that there were to be no other visitors, and that he had been telegraphed for with a very special object. Something was in the wind, and the something would doubtless bear fruit for this elderly spinster aunt, with a mania for psychical research, had brains as well as willpower, and by hook or by crook, she usually managed to accomplish her ends. The revelation was made soon after tea when she sidled up close to him as they paced slowly along the seafront in the dusk. "I've got the keys," she announced it in a delighted yet half-awesome voice. "Got them till Monday." "The keys of the bathing machine, or?" he asked innocently. Looking from the sea to the town, nothing brought her so quickly to the point as feigning stupidity. "Neither," she whispered. "I've got the keys of the haunted house in the square. I'm going there, tonight." Shorthouse was conscious of the slightest possible tremor down his back. He dropped his teasing tone. Something in her voice and manner thrilled him. She was in earnest. "But you can't go alone," he began. "That's why I wired for you," she said with decision. He turned to look at her. The ugly, lined, enigmatical face was alive with excitement. There was the glow of genuine enthusiasm round it like a halo. The eyes shone. He caught another wave of her excitement, and a second tremor, more marked than the first, accompanied it. "Thanks, Aunt Julia," he said politely. Thanks awfully." "I should not dare to go quite alone," she went on, raising her voice. "But with you, I should enjoy it immensely. You're afraid of nothing, I know." "Thanks so much," he said again. Is anything likely to happen?" "A great deal has happened," she whispered, "though it's been most cleverly hushed up. 3 tenants have come and gone in the last few months, and the house is said to be empty for good now." In spite of himself, Shorthouse became interested. His aunt was so very much in earnest. "The house is very old indeed," she went on, "and the story, an unpleasant one, dates a long way back. It has to do with a murder committed by a jealous stableman who had some affair with a servant in the house. One night, he managed to secrete himself in the cellar
And when everyone was asleep, he crept upstairs to the servants' quarters, chased the girl down to the next landing, and before anyone could come to the rescue, threw her body over the banisters into the hall below. And the stableman was caught, I believe, and he was hanged for murder. But it all happened a century ago, and I've not been able to get more details of the story. Shorthouse now felt his interest thoroughly aroused, but though he was not particularly nervous for himself, he hesitated a little on his aunt's account. Okay, on one condition, he said at length. Nothing will prevent my going, she said firmly, but I may as well hear your condition. That you guarantee your power of self-control if anything really horrible happens. I mean, that you are sure you won't get too frightened. Jim, she said scornfully. I'm not young, I know, nor are my nerves, but with you, I should be afraid of nothing in the world. This, of course, settled it, for Shorthouse had no pretensions to being other than a very ordinary young man, and an appeal to his vanity was irresistible. He agreed to go. Instinctively, by a sort of subconscious preparation, he kept himself and his forces well in hand the whole evening, compelling an accumulative reserve of control by that nameless inward process of gradually putting all the emotions away and turning the key upon them. A process difficult to describe, but wonderfully effective, as all men who have lived through severe trials of the inner man well understand. Later, it stood him in good stead. But it was not until 10:30 when they stood in the hall, well in the glare of friendly lamps, and still surrounded by comforting human influences, that he had to make the first call upon this store of collected strengths. For once the door was closed, and he saw the deserted, silent street stretching away white in the moonlight before them, it came to him clearly that the real test that night would be in dealing with two fears instead of one. He would have to carry his aunt's fear as well as his own, and as he glanced down at her sphinx-like countenance and realized that it might be no pleasant aspect in a rush of real terror, he felt satisfied with only one thing in the whole adventure: that he had confidence in his own will and power to stand against any shock that might come. Slowly, they walked along the empty streets of the town. A bright autumn moon silvered the roofs, casting deep shadows. There was no breath of wind, and the trees in the formal gardens by the seafront watched them silently as they passed along. To his aunt's occasional remarks, Shorthouse made no reply, realizing she was simply surrounding herself with mental buffers, saying ordinary things to prevent herself from thinking extraordinary things. Few windows showed lights, and from scarcely a single chimney came smoke or sparks. Shorthouse had already begun to notice everything, even the smallest details. Presently they stopped at the street corner and looked up at the name on the side of the house, full in the moonlight. And with one accord, but without remark, turned into the square and crossed over to the side of it that lay in shadow. "The number of the house is 13, whispered a voice at his side, and neither of them made the obvious reference, but passed across the broad sheet of moonlight and began to march up the pavement in silence. It was about halfway up the square that Shorthouse felt an arm slipped quietly, but significantly into his own, and knew then that their adventure had begun in earnest, in that his companion was already yielding imperceptibility to the influences against them. She needed support. A few minutes later, they stopped before a tall, narrow house that rose before them in the night, ugly in shape, and painted a dingy white.
shutterless windows without blinds, stared upon them, shining here and there in the moonlight. There were weather streaks in the wall and cracks in the paint, and the balcony bulged out from the first floor a little unnaturally. But beyond this generally forlorn appearance of an unoccupied house, there was nothing at first sight to single out this particular mansion. For the evil character it had most certainly acquired. Taking a look over their shoulders to make sure they had not been followed, they went boldly up the steps and stood against the huge black door that fronted them forbiddingly. But the first wave of nervousness was now upon them, and Shorthouse fumbled a long time with the keys before he could fit it into the lock at all. For a moment, if truth were told, they both hoped it would not open, for they were a prey to various unpleasant emotions as they stood there on the threshold of their ghostly adventure. Shorthouse, shuffling with the key and hampered by the steady weight on his arm, certainly felt the solemnity of the moment. It was as if the whole world, for all experience, seemed at that instant concentrated in his own consciousness, were listening to the grating noise of that key. A stray puff of wind wandering down the empty street woke a momentary rustling in the trees behind them. But otherwise, this rattling of the key was the only sound audible. And at last it turned in the lock, and the heavy door swung open and revealed a yawning gulf of darkness beyond. With a last glance of the moonlit square, they passed quickly in, and the door slammed behind them with a roar that echoed prodigiously through empty halls and passages. But instantly, with the echoes, another sound made itself heard, and Aunt Julia leaned suddenly so heavily upon him that he had to take a step backwards to save himself from falling. A man had coughed close beside them, so close that it seemed they must have been actually by his side in the darkness. With the possibility of practical jokes in his mind, Shorthouse at once swung his heavy stick in the direction of the sound, but it meant nothing more solid than air. He heard his aunt give a little gasp beside him. There's someone here," she whispered. I heard him." "Be quiet," he said sternly. "It was nothing but the sound of the front door." Get a light. Get a light, quick," she added, as her nephew, fumbling with a box of matches, opened it upside down and let them fall all with a rattle onto the stone floor. The sound, however, was not repeated, and there was no evidence of retreating footsteps. In another minute they had a candle burning, using an empty end of a cigar case as a holder. And when the first flare had died down, he held the impromptu lamp aloft and surveyed the scene. And it was dreary enough in all conscience, for there is nothing more desolate in all the abodes of men than an unfurnished house dimly lit, silent and forsaken, and yet tenanted by rumor with the memories of evil and violent histories. They were standing in a wide hallway. On their left was the open door of a spacious dining room, and in front the hall ran, ever narrowing, into a long dark passage that led apparently to the top of the kitchen stairs. The broad, uncarpeted staircase rose in a sweep before them, everywhere draped in shadows, except for a single spot, about halfway up, where the moonlight came in through the window and fell on a bright patch on the boards. This shaft of light shed a faint radiance above and below it. lending to the objects within its reach a misty outline that was infinitely more suggestive and ghostly than complete darkness. Filtered moonlight always seems to paint faces on the surrounding gloom, and as Shorthouse peered up into the well of darkness and thought of the countless empty rooms and passages in the upper part of the old house, he caught himself longing again for the safety of the moonlit square, or the cozy bright drawing room they had left an hour before. Then, realizing that these thoughts were dangerous, he thrust them away again and summoned all his energy for concentration on the present. "Aunt Julia," he said aloud, severely, "we must now go through the house from top to bottom and make a thorough search." The echoes of his voice died away slowly all over the building, and in the intense silence that followed, he turned to look at her. In the candlelight, he saw that her face was already ghastly pale, but she dropped his arm for a moment and said in a whisper, stepping close in front of him, "I agree. We must be sure there's no one hiding. That's the first thing." She spoke with evident effort, and he looked at her with admiration. "You feel quite sure of yourself? It's not too late." I think so," she whispered, her eyes shifting nervously towards the shadows behind. "Quite sure. Only one thing." "What's that?" "You must never leave me alone for an instant. As long as you understand that any sound or appearance must be investigated at once. For to hesitate means to admit fear, and that is fatal." "Okay, agreed," she said, a little shakily. After a moment's hesitation, I'll try." Arm in arm, Shorthouse holding the dripping candle and the stick, while his aunt carried the cloak over her shoulders, figures of utter comedy to all but themselves, they began a systematic search. Stealthily walking on tiptoe and shading the candle lest it should betray their presence through the shutterless windows, they went first into the big dining room. There was not a stick of furniture to be seen. Bare walls, ugly mantelpieces, and empty grates stared at them. Everything, they felt, resented their intrusion, watching them, as it were with veiled eyes. Whispers followed them. Shadows flitted noiselessly to right and left. Something seemed ever at their back, watching, waiting for an opportunity to do them injury. There was an inevitable sense that operations which went on when the room was empty had been temporarily suspended, till they were well out of the way again. The whole dark interior of the old building seemed to become a malignant presence that rose up, warning them to desist and mind their own business. Every moment the strain on the nerves increased. Out of the gloomy dining room they passed through large folding doors into a sort of library or smoking room, wrapped equally in silence, darkness, and dust. And from this they regained the hall near the top of the back stairs. Here, a pitch-black tunnel opened before them in the lower regions, and, if it must be confessed, they hesitated, but only for a minute. With the worst of the night still to come, it was essential to turn from nothing. Aunt Julia stumbled at the top step of the dark descent, ill-lit by the flickering candle, and even Shorthouse felt at least half the decision go out of his legs. "Come on," he said peremptorily, and his voice ran on and lost itself in the dark, empty spaces below. "I'm coming," she faltered, catching his arm with unnecessary violence. They went a little unsteadily down the stone steps, a cold, damp air meeting them in the face, close and malodorous. The kitchen, into which the stairs led along a narrow passage, was large, with a lofty ceiling. Several doors opened out of it, some into cupboards with empty jars still standing on the shelves, and others into horrible little ghostly back offices, each colder and less inviting than the last. Black beetles scurried across the floor, and once, when they knocked against the deal table standing in a corner, something about the size of a cat jumped down with a rush and fled, scampering across the stone floor into the darkness. Everywhere there was a sense of recent occupation, an impression of sadness and gloom. Leaving the main kitchen, they next went towards the scullery. The door was standing ajar, and as they pushed it open to its full extent, Aunt Julia uttered a piercing scream, which she instantly tried to stifle by placing her hand over her mouth. For a second, Shorthouse stood stock still, catching his breath. He felt as if his spine had suddenly become hollow and someone had filled it with particles of ice. Facing them, directly in their way, between the doorposts, stood the figure of a woman. She had disheveled hair and wildly staring eyes, and her face was terrified and white as death. "It's only the beastly jumping candlelight," he said quickly, in a voice that sounded like someone else's and was only under half control. "Come on, Aunt. There's nothing there. There's nothing there." He dragged her forward. With a clattering of feet and a great appearance of boldness, they went on. But over his body the skin moved as if crawling ants covered it, and he knew, by the weight on his arm, that he was supplying the force of locomotion for the two. The scullery was cold, bare, and empty, more like a large prison cell than anything else. They went round it, tried the door into the yard and the windows, but found them all fastened securely. His aunt moved beside him like a person in a dream. Her eyes were tightly shut, and she seemed merely to follow the pressure of his arm. Her courage filled him with amazement. At the same time, he noticed that a certain odd change had come over her face, a change which somehow evaded his power of analysis. There's nothing here, Auntie," he repeated aloud quickly. Let's go upstairs. Let's see the rest of the house. Then we'll choose a room to wait up in." She followed him obediently, keeping close to his side, and they locked the kitchen door behind them. It was a relief to get up again. In the hall there was more light than before, for the moon had traveled a little further down than the stairs. Cautiously, they began to go up into the dark vault of the upper house, the boards creaking under their weight. On the first floor, they found the large double drawing rooms, a search of which revealed nothing. Here also was no sign of furniture or recent occupancy, nothing but dust and neglect and shadows. They opened the big folding doors between front and back drawing rooms, and then came out again to the landing and went on upstairs. They had not gone up more than a dozen steps when they both simultaneously stopped to listen. Looking into each other's eyes, with a new apprehension across the flickering candle flame, from the room they had left hardly 10 seconds before came the sound of doors quietly closing. It was beyond all question. They heard the booming noise that accompanies the shutting of heavy doors, followed by the sharp catching of the latch. "We must go back and see," said Shorthouse briefly, in a low tone, and turning to go downstairs again. Somehow, she managed to drag after him, her feet catching in her dress, her face livid. When they entered the front drawing room, it was plain that the folding doors had been closed half a minute before. Without hesitation, Shorthouse opened them. He almost expected to see someone facing him in the back room, but only darkness and cold air met him. They went through both rooms, finding nothing unusual. They tried in every way to make the doors close of themselves, but there was not enough wind, even to set the candle flame flickering. The doors would not move without a strong pressure. All was silent as the grave. Undeniably, the rooms were utterly empty, and the house utterly still.
"It's beginning,"
whispered a voice at his elbow, which he hardly recognized as his aunt's. He nodded acquiescence, taking out his watch to note the time. It was 15 minutes before midnight. He made the entry of exactly what had occurred in his notebook, setting the candle in its case upon the floor in order to do so. It took a moment or two to balance it safely against the wall. Aunt Julia always declared that at this moment, she was not actually watching him, but had turned her head towards the inner room, where she fancied she heard something moving. But, at any rate, both positively agreed that there came a sound of rushing feet, heavy and very swift. And the next instant, the candle was out. But to Shorthouse himself had come more than this, and he has always thanked his fortunate stars that it came to him alone, and not to his aunt too. For as he rose from the stooping position of balancing the candle, and before it was actually extinguished, a face thrust itself forward, so close to his own that he could almost have touched it with his lips. It was a face working with passion, a man's face, dark, with thick features, and angry, savage eyes. It belonged to a common man, and it was evil in its ordinary normal expression, no doubt. But as he saw it, alive, with intense, aggressive emotion, it was a malignant and terrible human countenance. There was no movement of the air, nothing but the sound of rushing feet, stockinged or muffled feet, the apparition of the face, and the almost simultaneous extinguishing of the candle. In spite of himself, Shorthouse uttered a little cry.
What the?
Nearly losing his balance as his aunt clung to him with her whole weight in one moment of real, uncontrollable terror. She made no sound, but simply seized him bodily. Fortunately, however, she had seen nothing, but had only heard the rushing feet, for her control returned almost at once, and he was able to disentangle himself and strike a match. The shadows ran away on all sides before the glare, and his aunt stooped down and groped for the cigar case with the precious candle. Then they discovered that the candle had not been blown out at all. It had been crushed out. The wick was pressed down into the wax, which was flattened as if by some smooth, heavy instrument. How his companion so quickly overcame her terror, Shorthouse never properly understood. But his admiration for her self-control increased tenfold, and at the same time served to feed his own dying flame, for which he was undeniably grateful. Equally inexplicable to him was the evidence of a physical force they had just witnessed. He at once suppressed the memory of stories he had heard of physical mediums and their dangerous phenomena. For, if these were true, and either his aunt or himself was unwittingly a physical medium, it meant that they were simply aiding to focus the forces of a haunted house already charged to the brim. It was like walking with unprotected lamps among uncovered stores of gunpowder. So with as little reflection as possible, he simply relit the candle and went up to the next floor. The arm in his trembled, it is true, and his own tread was often uncertain. But they went on with thoroughness, and after a search revealing nothing, they climbed the last flight of stairs to the top floor of all. Here they found a perfect nest of small servants' rooms, with broken pieces of furniture, dirty cane-bottomed chairs, chests of drawers, cracked mirrors, and decrepit bedsteads. The rooms had low sloping ceilings, already hung here and there with cobwebs, small windows, and badly plastered walls. A depressing and dismal region which they were glad to leave behind. It was on the stroke of midnight when they entered a small room on the 3rd floor, close to the top of the stairs, and arranged to make themselves comfortable for the remainder of their adventure. It was absolutely bare, and was said to be the room, then used as a clothes closet, into which the infuriated groom had chased his victim and finally caught her. Outside, across the narrow landing, began the stairs leading up to the floor above, and the servants' quarters where they had just searched. In spite of the chilliness of the night, there was something in the air of this room that cried for an open window. But there was more than this. Shorthouse could only describe it by saying that he felt less master of himself here than in any part of the house. There was something that acted directly on the nerves, tiring the resolution, enfeebling the will. He was conscious of this result before he had been in the room 5 minutes, and it was in the short time they stayed there that he suffered the wholesale depletion of his vital forces, which was, for himself, the chief horror of the whole experience. They put the candle on the floor of the cupboard, leaving the door a few inches ajar, so that there was no glare to confuse the eyes and no shadow to shift about on walls and ceiling. Then they spread the cloak on the floor and sat down to wait with their backs against the wall. Shorthouse was within 2 feet of the door onto the landing. His position commanded a good view of the main staircase leading down into the darkness, and also of the beginning of the servants' stairs going to the floor above. The heavy stick lay beside him within easy reach. The moon was now high above the house. Through the open window they could see the comforting stars like friendly eyes watching in the sky. One by one, the clocks of the town struck midnight, and when the sounds died away, the deep silence of a windless night fell again over everything. Only the boom of the sea, far away and lugubrious, filled the air with hollow murmurs. Inside the house, the silence became awful. Awful, he thought, because any minute now, it might be broken by sounds portending terror. The strain of waiting told more and more severely on the nerves. They talked in whispers, when they talked at all. For their voices aloud sounded queer and unnatural. A chilliness not altogether due to the night air invaded the room and made them cold. The influences against them, whatever these might be, were slowly robbing them of self-confidence and the power of decisive action. Their forces were on the wane, and the possibility of real fear took on a new and terrible meaning. He began to tremble for the elderly woman by his side, whose pluck could hardly save her beyond a certain extent. He heard the blood singing in his veins. It sometimes seemed so loud that he fancied it prevented his hearing properly certain other sounds that were beginning to very faintly make themselves audible in the depths of the house. Every time he fastened his attention on these sounds, they instantly ceased. They certainly came no nearer. Yet, he could not rid himself of the idea that movement was going on somewhere in the lower regions of the house. The drawing room floor, where the doors had been so strangely closed, seemed too near. The sounds were further off than that. He thought of the great kitchen, with the scurrying black beetles, and of the dismal little scullery. But somehow or other, they did not seem to come from there either. Surely they were not outside the house. Then suddenly, the truth flashed into his mind, and for the space of a minute, he felt as if his blood had stopped flowing and turned to ice. The sounds were not downstairs at all. They were upstairs. Upstairs, somewhere among those horrid, gloomy little servants' rooms with their bits of broken furniture, low ceilings and crammed windows. Upstairs, where the victim had first been disturbed and stalked to her death. And in the moment he discovered where the sounds were, he began to hear them more clearly. It was the sound of feet, moving stealthily along the passage overhead, in and out among the rooms and past the furniture. He turned quickly to steal a glance at the motionless figure seated beside him, to note whether she had shared his discovery. The faint candlelight coming through the crack in the cupboard door threw her strongly marked face into vivid relief against the white of the wall. But it was something else that made him catch his breath and stare again. An extraordinary something had come into her face and seemed to spread over her features like a mask. It smoothed out the deep lines and drew the skin everywhere a little tighter so that the wrinkles disappeared. It brought into the face, with the sole exception of the old eyes, an appearance of youth and almost of childhood. He stared in speechless amazement, amazement that was dangerously near to horror. It was his aunt's face indeed, but it was her face of 40 years ago, the vacant, innocent face of a girl. He had heard stories of that strange effect of terror which could wipe a human countenance clean of other emotions, obliterating all previous expressions. But he had never realized that it could be literally true, or could mean anything so simply horrible as what he now saw. For the dreadful signature of overmastering fear was written plainly in that utter vacancy of the girlish face beside him. And when, feeling his intense gaze, she turned to look at him, he instinctively closed his eyes tightly to shut out the sight. Yet, when he turned a minute later, his feelings well in hand, he saw to his intense relief another expression. His aunt was smiling, and though the face was deathly white, the awful veil had lifted, and the normal look was returning. "Anything wrong?" was all he could think of to say at the moment, and the answer was eloquent, coming from such a woman. I feel cold and a little frightened," she whispered. He offered to close the windows, but she seized hold of him and begged him not to leave her side even for an instant. It's upstairs, I know," she whispered with an odd laugh, "but I can't possibly go up." But Shorthouse thought otherwise, knowing that in action lay their best hope of self-control. He took out the brandy flask and poured out a glass of neat spirit, stiff enough to help anybody over anything. She swallowed it with a little shiver. His only idea now was to get out of the house before her collapse became inevitable. But this could not safely be done by turning tail and running from the enemy. Inaction was no longer possible. Every minute he was growing less master of himself and desperate. Aggressive measures were imperative without further delay. Moreover, the action must be taken towards the enemy, not away from it. The climax, if necessary and unavoidable, would have to be faced boldly. He could do it now, but in 10 minutes he might not have the force left to act for himself, much less for both. Upstairs, the sounds were meanwhile becoming louder and closer, accompanied by occasional creaking of the boards. Something was moving stealthily about, stumbling now and then awkwardly against the furniture. Waiting a few moments to allow the tremendous dose of spirits to produce its effect, and knowing this would last but a short time under the circumstances, Shorthouse then quietly got on his feet, saying in a determined voice, "Now, Aunt Julia, we'll go upstairs and find out what all this noise is about. You must come too. It's what we agreed." He picked up his stick and went to the cupboard for the candle. A limp form rose shakily beside him, breathing hard. And he heard a voice say very faintly something about being ready to come. The woman's courage amazed him. It was so much greater than his own, and as they advanced, holding aloft the dripping candle, some subtle force exhaled from this trembling, white-faced old woman at his side. That was the true source of his inspiration. It held something really great that shamed him, and gave him the support without which he would have proved far less equal to the occasion. They crossed the dark landing, avoiding with their eyes the deep black space over the banisters. Then they began to mount the narrow staircase to meet the sounds, which minute by minute grew louder and nearer. About halfway up the stairs, Aunt Julia stumbled, and Shorthouse turned to catch her by the arm. And just at that moment, there came a terrific crash in the servants' corridor overhead. It was instantly followed by a shrill, agonized scream. That was a cry of terror and a cry for help melted into one. Before they could move aside or go down a single step, someone came rushing along the passage overhead, blundering horribly, racing madly at full speed, 3 steps at a time, down the very staircase where they stood. The steps were light and uncertain, but close behind them sounded the heavier tread of another person, and the staircase seemed to shake. Shorthouse and his companion just had time to flatten themselves against the wall when the jumble of flying steps was upon them, and 2 persons, with the slightest possible interval between them, dashed past at full speed. It was a perfect whirlwind of sound breaking in upon the midnight silence of the empty building. The 2 runners, pursuer and pursued, had passed clean through them where they stood, and already with a thud the boards below had received first one, then the other. Yet they had seen absolutely nothing, not a hand or arm or face, or even a shred of flying clothing. There came a second's pause. Then the first one, the lighter of the 2, obviously the pursued one, ran with uncertain footsteps into the little room which Shorthouse and his aunt had just left. The heavier one followed. There was a sound of scuffling, gasping, and smothered screaming, and then out onto the landing came the step of a single person, treading weightily. A dead silence followed for the space of a half a minute, and then was heard a rushing sound through the air. It was followed by a dull crashing thud in the depths of the house below, on the stone floor of the hall. Utter silence reigned after. Nothing moved. The flame of the candle was steady. It had been steady the whole time, and the air had been undisturbed by any movement whatsoever. Palsied with terror, Aunt Julia, without waiting for her companion, began fumbling her way downstairs. She was crying gently to herself, and when Shorthouse put his arm around her and half carried her, he felt that she was like a trembling leaf. He went into the little room and picked up the cloak from the floor, and arm in arm, walking very slowly, without speaking a word or looking once behind them, they marched down the 3 flights into the hall. In the hall they saw nothing, but the whole way down the stairs they were conscious that someone had followed them step by step. When they went faster, it was left behind, and when they went more slowly, it caught up. But never once did they look behind to see. And at each turning of the staircase, they lowered their eyes for fear of the following horror they might see upon the stairs above. With trembling hands, Shorthouse opened the front door, and they walked out into the moonlight and drew a deep breath of the cool night air blowing in from the sea.
There is something ungodly about these night wire jobs. You sit up here in the top floor of a skyscraper and listen into the whispers of a civilization. New York, London, Calcutta, Bombay, Singapore. They're your next-door neighbors after the streetlights go dim and the world has gone to sleep. Alone, in the quiet hours between 2 and 4, the receiving operators doze over their sounders, and the news comes in. Fires and disasters and suicides, murders, crowds, catastrophes. Sometimes an earthquake with a casualty list as long as your arm. The nightwire man takes it down almost in his sleep, picking it off on his typewriter with one finger. Once in a long time, you prick up your ears and listen. You've heard of someone you knew in Singapore, Halifax, or Paris, long ago. Maybe they've been promoted, but more probably they've been murdered or drowned. Perhaps they just decided to quit and took some bizarre way out. Made it interesting enough to get in the news. But doesn't happen often. Most of the time you sit and doze and tap on your typewriter and wish you were home in bed. Sometimes, though, queer things happen. One did the other night, and I haven't gotten over it yet. I wish I could. You see, I handle the night manager's desk in a western seaport town. What the name is doesn't matter. There is, or rather was, only one night operator on my staff, a fellow named John Morgan, about 40 years of age, I should say, and a sober, hard-working sort. He was one of the best operators I ever knew, what is known as a double man. That means he could handle 2 instruments at once and type the stories on different typewriters at the same time. He was one of 3 men I ever knew who could do it consistently, hour after hour, and never make a mistake. Generally, we used only one wire at night. But sometimes, when it was late, and the news was coming fast, the Chicago and Denver stations would open a second wire, and then Morgan would do his stuff. He was a wizard. A mechanical, automatic wizard which functioned marvelously, but was without imagination. On the night of the 16th, he complained of feeling tired. It was the first time and last time I had ever heard him say a word about himself. And I had known him for 3 years. It was just 3 o'clock. We were running only one wire. I was nodding over the reports at my desk, not paying much attention to him when he spoke.
Jim,
He said,
does it feel close in here to you?
Why, no, John,
I answered.
but I'll open a window if you like.
Never mind.
He said,
I reckon I'm just a little tired.
That was all that was said, and I went on working. Every 10 minutes or so, I would walk over and take a pile of copy that stacked up neatly beside the typewriter, as the messages were printed out in triplicate. Must have been 20 minutes after he spoke that I noticed he had opened up the other wire, was using both typewriters. I thought it was a little unusual. There was nothing very hot coming in. On my next trip, I picked up the copy from both machines. I took it back to my desk to sort out the duplicates. The first wire was running out the usual sort of stuff, and I just looked over it hurriedly. Then I turned to the second pile of copy. I remembered it particularly because the story was from a town I'd never heard of. Zebico. Here is the dispatch. I saved a duplicate of it from our files. Zebico, September 16th, CP Bulletin. The heaviest mist in the history of the city settled over the town at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. All traffic had stopped, and the mist hangs like a pall over everything. Lights of ordinary intensity fail to pierce the fog, which is constantly growing heavier. Scientists here are unable to agree as to the cause, and the local weather bureau states that the like has never occurred before in the history of the city. At 7 p.m. last night, the municipal authorities... That's all there was. Nothing out of the ordinary at a bureau headquarters, but as I say, I noticed the story because of the name of the town. Must have been 15 minutes later that I went over for another batch of copy. Morgan was slumped down in his chair. He had switched his green electric light shades so that the gleam missed his eyes, hit only the top of the 2 typewriters. Only the usual stuff was in the right-hand pile, but the left-hand batch carried another story from Zebico. All press dispatches come in takes, meaning that the parts of the different stories are strung along together, perhaps with but a few paragraphs of each coming through at a time. The second story was marked Add Fog. Here's the copy. At 7 p.m., the fog had increased noticeably. All lights were now invisible and the town was shrouded in pitch darkness. At a peculiarity of the phenomenon, the fog is accompanied by a sickly odor, comparable to nothing yet experienced here. Below that in customary press fashion was the hour 3:27 and the initials of the operator, J.M. There was only one other story in the pile from the second wire. Here it is. Second, add Zebico fog. Accounts as to the origin of the mist differ greatly. Among the most usual is that of the sexton of the local church, who groped his way to headquarters in a hysterical condition, and declared that the fog originated in the village churchyard. It was first visible as a soft gray blanket clinging to the earth above the graves, he stated. Then it began to rise higher and higher. A subterranean breeze seemed to blow it in billows, which split up and then joined together again. Fog phantoms, writhing in anguish, twisted the mist into queer forms and figures. And then, in the very thick midst of the mass, something moved. I turned and ran from the accursed spot. Behind me, I heard screams coming from the houses bordering on the graveyard. Although the sexton's story is generally discredited, a part has left to investigate immediately after telling his story. The sexton collapsed and is now in a local hospital unconscious. Queer story, wasn't it? Not that we're not used to it, for a lot of unusual stories come in over the wire. But for some reason or other, perhaps because it was so quiet that night, the report of the fog made a great impression on me. It was almost with dread that I went over to the waiting piles of copy. Morgan did not move, and the only sound in the room was the tap-tap of the sounders. It was ominous, nerve-wracking. There was another story from Zebico in the pile of copy. I seized on it anxiously. New lead. Zebico Fog, CP. The rescue party which went out at 11 p.m. to investigate a weird story of the origin of a fog which, since late yesterday, has shrouded the city in darkness, has failed to return. Another and larger party has been dispatched. Meanwhile, the fog has, if possible, grown heavier. It seeps through the cracks in the doors, fills the atmosphere with a depressing odor of decay. It is oppressive, terrifying, bearing with it a subtle impression of things long dead. Residents of the city have left their homes and gathered in the local church, where the priests are holding services of prayer. The scene is beyond description. Grown folk and children alike are terrified, and many are almost beside themselves with fear. Amid the wisps of vapor which partly veil the church auditorium, an old priest is praying for the welfare of his flock. They alternately wail and cross themselves. From the outskirts of the city may be heard cries of unknown voices. They echo through the fog in queer, incandescent minor keys. The sounds resemble nothing so much as wind whistling through a gigantic tunnel. But the night is calm, and there is no wind. The second rescue party. I am a calm man. Never in a dozen years spent with the wires have I been known to become excited. But despite myself, I rose from the chair and walked to the window. Could I be mistaken? Or far down in the canyons of the city beneath me, did I see a faint trace of fog? Pshaw, it was all imagination. In the press room, the click of the sounders seemed to have raised the tempo of their tune. Morgan alone had not stirred from his chair. His head sunk between his shoulders. He tapped the dispatches out on the typewriters with one finger of each hand. He looked asleep. Maybe he was, but no. Endlessly, efficiently, the two machines rattled off line after line. As relentlessly and effortlessly as death itself, there was something about the monotonous movement of the typewriter keys that fascinated me. I walked over and stood behind his chair, reading over his shoulder, the type as it came into being word for word. Here was another. Flash, Zebico, CP. There will be no more bulletins from this office. The impossible has happened. No messages have come into this room for 20 minutes. We are cut off from the outside, and even the streets below us. I will stay with the wire until the end. It is the end, indeed. Since 4 p.m. yesterday, the fog has hung over the city. Following reports from the sexton of the local church, 2 rescue parties were sent out to investigate conditions on the outskirts of the city. Neither party has returned, nor was any word received from them. It's quite certain now that they will never return. From my instrument, I can gaze down on the city beneath me. From this position of this room on the 13th floor, nearly the entire city can be seen. Now, I can see only a thick blanket of blackness, where customarily are lights and life. I fear greatly that the wailing cries heard constantly from the outskirts of the city are the death cries of the inhabitants. They're constantly increasing in volume and are approaching the center of the city. The fog yet hangs over everything. If possible, it is even heavier than before, but the conditions have changed. Instead of an opaque, impenetrable wall of odorous vapor, there now swirls and writhes shapeless mass and contortions of almost human agony. Now and again, the mass parts and I catch a brief glimpse of the streets below. People are running to and fro, screaming in despair. A vast bedlam of sounds fly up to my window, and above all is the immense whistling of unseen and unfelt winds. The fog has again swept over the city, and the whistling is coming closer and closer. It is now directly beneath me. God! An instant ago, the mist opened and I caught a glimpse of the streets below. The fog is not simply vapor, it lives. By the side of each moaning and weeping human is a companion figure, an aura of strange and vari-colored hues. How the shapes cling, each to a living thing. The men and women are down, flat on their faces. The fog figures caress them lovingly. They're kneeling beside them. They are... But I dare not tell it. The prone and writhing bodies have been stripped of their clothing. They are being consumed, piecemeal. A merciful wall of hot, steaming vapor has swept over the whole scene. I can see no more. Beneath me, the wall of vapor is changing colors. It seems to be lighted by internal fires. No, it isn't. I've made a mistake. The colors are from above, reflections from the sky. Look up! Look up! The whole sky is in flames. Colors as yet unseen by man or demon. The flames are moving. They've started to intermix. The colors are rearranging themselves. They are so brilliant that my eyes burn. They are a long way off. Now they have begun to swirl, to circle in and out, twisting in intricate designs and patterns. The lights are racing each with each, a kaleidoscope of unearthly brilliance. I have made a discovery. There's nothing harmful in the lights. They radiate force and friendliness, almost cheeriness. By their very strength, they hurt. As I look, they're swinging closer and closer. 1,000,000 miles at each jump. Millions of miles with the speed of light. Aye, it is light of quintessence of all light. Beneath it the fog melts into jeweled mist, radiant, rainbow-colored of 1,000 varied spectra. I can see the streets. Why, they're filled with people. The lights are coming closer. They are all around me. I'm enveloped. The message stopped abruptly. The wire to Zebico was dead. Beneath my eyes in the narrow circle of light from under the green lampshade, the black printing no longer spun itself, letter by letter, across the page. The room seemed filled with a solemn quiet, a silence vaguely impressive, powerful. I looked down at Morgan. His hands had dropped nervously at his sides, while his body had hunched over peculiarly. I turned the lampshade back, throwing light squarely in his face. His eyes were staring, fixed. Filled with a sudden foreboding, I stepped beside him and called Chicago on the wire. After a second, the sounder clicked its answer. Why? But there was something wrong. Chicago was reporting that Wire 2 had not been used throughout the evening. Morgan! I shouted. Morgan, wake up! It isn't true. Someone's been hoaxing us. Why? In my eagerness, I grasped him by the shoulder. His body was quite cold. Morgan had been dead for hours. Could it be that his sensitized brain and automatic fingers had continued to record impressions even after the end? I shall never know, for I shall never again handle the night shift. Search in a world atlas discloses no town of Zebico. Whatever it was that killed John Morgan will forever remain a mystery.
It is with great haste that I write this, having just consumed a great quantity of fertilizer. My limbs are seizing and pain racks my every movement, but I can think with a clarity I've not felt in days. It is imperative that I leave this record, and I will attempt to master my nerves, that this might be legible. I had been in Cape Colony for a week, called there to assist Sir Hely Hutchinson in dealing with the rebels that had plunged the colony into civil war for 3 years. I was to manage one of the camps for refugees. I despised Africa immediately, a hot, dry, and filthy country full of disease.
The only respite I had in this time was my manservant Walter. His constant presence at my side saved more than a few subordinates from reprimand. Walter seemed to take the continent far better than I. My work weighed heavily on me, and Walter's encouragement kept me at my desk even as further reports of deaths came in weekly. No matter what I requisitioned, they continued to expire in droves, and if I could not curtail it soon, I would be removed from my post in disgrace. It was this that brought me to what I believe was my point of exposure. Walter led me from my office in the government building to the camp that I was responsible for. The area was safe, and I felt more than comfortable leaving my revolver behind in my office. It was a sweltering day, and were it not for proper breeding as an Englishman, I should have removed my coat. I needed to ascertain the reason for the continued decline in population, and also estimate how much more the local graveyard could hold. The camp was teeming with the emaciated. It was most frustrating. I requisitioned all the food I dared, and now, seeing my changes for the first time, I could see that my efforts had been wasted. The crates of food remained piled in the center of the camp, reeking of spoilage. The people milled about aimlessly in the sun, shamelessly undressed. They had no drive to eat. They were killing themselves through sloth. Many of them lacked even the desire to move out of the sun, some of them being visibly blistered. Talking to them proved useless. Walter spoke to them in my stead. Those who could speak simply shrugged and said they hadn't noticed the food or the hunger or the deaths. When pressed, when Walter begged them to explain themselves, they ignored him. Frustrated, I called him off and I asked him to take me to the next leg of our trip. The graveyard was one in only the loosest of definitions. It was comprised of large, unmarked mass graves, more an abattoir than cemetery. It certainly wasn't fit for a proper servant of the crown. Even for the people in the camp, it didn't seem like enough. One of the largest graves wasn't even filled properly. I could see a hand protruding out from the mound of earth. It attracted my gaze to the flower poking out from the side of the earth. Was a vibrant purple flower. I knelt down and examined the bloom. I grasped it by the stem to pick it and cut my finger on the thorns hidden beneath the petals. I drew back my hand, drawing the cut down the full length of my finger. A small rivulet of blood dripped onto the ground. Walter reacted, cutting a strip from his shirt with his knife and quickly tying it over the wound. I asked that he take me home. Without Walter, I suspect I would never have noticed the changes that consumed me. The peculiarities began 2 days later. I began shedding my clothes. My coat fell into disuse and was discarded entirely after 4 days. I recall only that I was warm. I didn't think it odd to be about in a state of undress. It simply seemed the most obvious way of cooling down. Soon after, my waistcoat, too, was gone. A week after the visit, I was shirtless. I had felt too confined in my office. The walls were getting to me, and I felt a tremendous desire to venture outside. I must have spent several hours milling about the courtyard of the government. It was nearly sunset before Walter found me. He had been searching the building for hours before looking outside on a whim. I laughed. "I'm sorry. I'll keep you abreast of my wanderings next time. It was a flight of fancy." "Are you all right, sir? You never go outside except on business." "Walter, I'm fine. I was simply taken with the desire to walk." "Sir, I think you should see the doctor." "Walter, I'm perfectly—" Walter cut me off by grasping my right arm. He ignited an explosion of pain where he touched me. Walter raised my arm. It was deep red from sunburn. I looked down. My entire body had been burnt to blistering. I hadn't felt a thing. In fact, I still wanted to be outside, but I was shaken and I allowed Walter to lead me to the doctor. I was given an ointment to ease the burns. I was restricted to my bed for the next 2 days, applying the ointment myself. I tried to piece out what might be wrong with me. I felt fine, aside from a lingering desire to be outside. It was a deep longing and consumed my thoughts. I reviewed my work from the previous week and discovered numerous errors. I could only attribute it to the distraction my longing presented. I even forgotten to feed myself. Had Walter not made it a point to regularly bring me food, I think I might have risked starvation. It wasn't until then that I realized that, for days now, I'd been exposing myself at work and now in public. It didn't bother me. I didn't want the shirt or the vest or the jacket. I was troubled that it didn't bother me. After 2 days of bed rest, I forced myself to return to work. Only one thing remained: another visit to the doctor to check up on my burns. I forced myself to don my full suit. Even as sweat beaded on my brow with each layer, I arrived at my appointment as scheduled, and the doctor was quite jovial. I disrobed my shirt for him. He rolled up my sleeves. My skin was peeling off in chunks. The blisters had gone. He was quite pleased with my progress. He passed behind me to finish the examination form. I was about to put my shirt back on when he stopped me.
Hold a moment. You have... It looks like a sliver here on your back,
he said, gripping my shoulder lightly. He gave a closer inspection of my back.
The little things are all over. You must have almost 24. No, 3. Not sure what they are, but you should have your bedding checked. They're quite large. One moment. I'll remove them.
The physician moved over to his table and picked up his surgical knife. He walked back toward me. Rage rushed over me. I acted without thinking. He held one hand out from my shoulder to hold me steady. My body twisted off the chair and rose to stand while knocking his hand aside. My fist struck his face, sending him sprawling onto the ground. My hands closed around the chair. My body loomed over the physician. One swing of the chair knocked aside the arm he was using to defend himself. My body fell to its knees over the physician and brought the chair down again onto his skull, dashing his brains out onto the floor. The chair continued to come down until it shattered into pieces against the floor. The physician's head had been ruined. He was unrecognizable. His body's tremors had been done for minutes by the time I stopped. I stood up and backed away from the body and into a nurse who had been attracted by the noise. She had been too shocked to stop me. She screamed as I backed into her, and I whirled around. The lie slipped out easily. I pointed to the surgical knife still in the physician's hand. He attacked me. I had to defend myself. I quickly fled the examination room as the shocked nurse continued to stare at the corpse. I tracked down Walter, finding him in my office. I explained what happened. You killed him, sir? I didn't think about it. It just happened. I was moving. It started when he went to cut out these slivers, I said, turning so Walter could see my back. I want you to remove them, but restrain me. Walter nodded and fetched a chair. When I was securely tied to it, Walter went about examining my back. He counted 32 little green slivers in all. Walter cautioned me and drew his knife. I winced as he made a small incision in my back and fished underneath the sliver with his knife. Pain struck my entire body as steel touched the thing. Rage flashed over me, and my body thrashed in its bonds, but was held securely. Sir, it's much longer than it appears, Walter said, pulling on the sliver and sending more pain coursing through me. It feels like a vine or root. I think all of them may be connected. Sir, I don't think we can remove them. How did this happen? I don't know, Walter, I said. Maybe that flower I cut myself on in the cap. Walter gripped my right hand in his left hand and carefully cut his bandage away. The cut had healed, but a thick green vein was clearly visible beneath the skin. Walter cut me free. Get dressed, sir, Walter instructed. What for? We're going back to the camp. If this can make you murder a man, we must eradicate the plant. Yes, of course, I said. Will you be all right on your own, sir, for a moment? I need to gather a few things. We'll need to leave before the soldiers come for you. I can handle myself, Walter. Walter left to gather his things as I went to my own quarters. I changed into a new suit. I was so distracted I barely noticed when I slipped my revolver into my pocket. I wanted to take it. I felt I might need it. I finished locking my things up when Walter arrived at my door. I shot him. Walter stumbled forward and his hand found his knife. The revolver was empty before I stopped firing. I knelt next to him. I couldn't make it to the graveyard. I no longer wanted to. I searched through Walter's pack, discovering oil and matches. I took his knife, cut the strap, and took his sack. I couldn't dispose of the graveyard, but I could dispose of myself. The flower had grown on and bloomed on one of the corpses. If I were to be arrested for my crimes, I would be sent back to Britain. I would be executed. I took my small chest, emptying it of my meager belongings, and stole out of the government building and ran to the gardener's shed. I took the inventory records down from their hook. I had to leave this record. You must understand. There, I set upon the work of depositing the oil about the shed. I stopped as my eyes fell upon the bags of fertilizer. They looked so good. I tossed the oil aside and sliced a bag open and began shoveling handfuls into my mouth. It tasted like fire as I swallowed it. The pain brought me back. There was no more time. I began writing. With this concluded, I need only to start fire. I can hear the search parties roaming the ground. I will make sure this letter survives my immolation. My body in the camp must be destroyed. I leave it to you, Charles Wallace.
In my tortured ears, there sounds increasingly a nightmare whirring and flapping, and a faint, distant baying, as of some gigantic hound. It is not a dream. It is not, I fear, even madness. For too much had already happened to give me these merciful doubts. St. John is a mangled corpse. I alone know why. And such is my knowledge, that I am about to blow out my brains for fear I shall be mangled in the same way. Down, unlit and illimitable corridors of eldritch fantasy sweeps the black, shapeless nemesis that drives me to self-annihilation. May heaven forgive the folly and morbidity which led us both to so monstrous a fate. Wearied with the commonplace of a prosaic world, where even the joys of romance and adventure soon grow stale, St. John and I had followed enthusiastically every aesthetic and intellectual movement which promised respite from our devastating ennui. The enigmas of the symbolists and the ecstasies of the pre-Raphaelites, all were ours in their time, but each new mood was drained too soon of its diverting novelty and appeal. Only the somber philosophy of the decadence could hold us, and this we found potent only by increasingly gradually the depth and diabolism of our penetrations. Baudelaire and Huysmans were soon exhausted of thrills, till finally there remained for us only the more direct stimuli of unnatural personal experiences and adventures. It was this frightful emotional need which led us eventually to that detestable course, which even in my present fear I mention with shame and timidity, that hideous extremity of human outrage, the abhorred practice of grave robbing. I cannot reveal the details of our shocking expeditions or catalog, even party the worst of the trophies adorning the nameless museum we prepared in the great stone house where we jointly dwelt.
alone and servantless. Our museum was a blasphemous, unthinkable place, where with the satanic taste of neurotic virtuosi, we had assembled a universe of terror and decay to excite our jaded sensibilities. It was a secret room, far, far underground, where huge winged demons carven of basalt and onyx vomited from wide grinning mouths, weird green and orange light, and hidden pneumatic pipes ruffled into kaleidoscope dances of death, the lines of red charnel things, hand in hand, woven in voluminous black hangings. Through these pipes came at will the odors our moods most craved. Sometimes the scent of pale funeral lilies, sometimes the narcotic incense of imagined eastern shrines of the kingly dead, and sometimes, how I shudder to recall it, the frightful, soul-upheaving stenches of the uncovered grave. Around the walls of this repellent chamber were cases of antique mummies, alternating with comely, lifelike bodies perfectly stuffed and cured by the taxidermist's art, and with the headstones snatched from the oldest churchyards of the world. Niches here and there contained skulls of all shapes, and heads preserved in various stages of dissolution. There, one might find the rotting, bald patés of famous noblemen, and the fresh and radiantly golden heads of new buried children. Statues and paintings there were, all of fiendish subjects, and some executed by St. John and myself. A locked portfolio, bound in tanned human skin, held certain unknown and unnameable drawings, which it was rumored Goya had perpetrated but dared not acknowledge. There were nauseous musical instruments, stringed, brass, and woodwind, on which St. John and I sometimes produced dissonances of exquisite morbidity and casodemoniacal ghastliness, whilst in a multitude of inlaid ebony cabinets reposed the most incredible and unimaginable variety of tomb loot ever assembled by human madness and perversity. It is of this loot in particular that I must not speak. Thank God I had the courage to destroy it long before I thought of destroying myself. The predatory excursions on which we collected our unmentionable treasures were always artistically memorable events. We were no vulgar ghouls, but worked only under certain conditions of mood, landscape, environment, weather, season, and moonlight. These pastimes were to us the most exquisite form of aesthetic expression, and we gave their details a fastidious technical care. An inappropriate hour, a jarring lighting effect, or a clumsy manipulation of the damp sod would almost totally destroy for us that ecstatic titillation which followed the exhumation of some ominous, grinning secret of the earth. Our quest for novel scenes in piquant conditions was feverish and insatiate. St. John was always the leader, and it was he who led the way at last to that mocking, that accursed spot, which brought us our hideous and inevitable doom. By what malign fatality were we lured to that terrible Holland churchyard? I think it was the dark rumor and legend, the tales of one buried for 5 centuries, who had himself been a ghoul in his time, and had stolen a potent thing from a mighty sepulchre. I can recall the scenes in these final moments, the pale autumnal moon over the graves, casting long, horrible shadows, the grotesque trees drooping sullenly to meet the neglected grass and the crumbling slabs, the vast legions of strangely colossal bats that flew against the moon, the antique ivied church, pointing a huge spectral finger at the livid sky. Phosphorescent insects that danced like death fires under the yews in a distant corner. The odors of mold, vegetation, and less explicable things that mingled feebly with the night wind from over far swamps and seas. And worst of all, the faint, deep-toned baying of some gigantic hound, which we could neither see nor definitely place. As we heard this suggestion of baying, we shuddered, remembering the tales of the peasantry. For he whom we sought had centuries before been found in this selfsame spot, torn and mangled by the claws and teeth of some unspeakable beast. I remembered how we delved in this ghoul's grave with our spades, and how we thrilled at the picture of ourselves, the grave, the pale watching moon, the horrible shadows, the grotesque trees, the titanic bats, the antique church, the dancing death fires, the sickening odors, the gently moaning night wind, and the strange, half-heard, directionless baying, of whose objective existence we could scarcely be sure. Then we struck a substance harder than the damp mold, and beheld a rotting oblong box crusted with mineral deposits. From the long undisturbed ground, it was incredibly tough and thick, but so old that we finally pried it open and feasted our eyes on what it held. Much, amazingly much, was left of the object despite the lapse of 500 years. The skeleton, though crushed in places by the jaws of the thing that had killed it, held together with surprising firmness, and we gloated over the clean white skull and its long, firm teeth, and its eyeless sockets that once had glowed with a charnel fever like our own. In the coffin lay an amulet of curious and exotic design, which had apparently been worn around the sleeper's neck. It was the oddly conventionalized figure of a crouching, winged hound or sphinx with a semi-canine face, and was exquisitely carved in antique oriental fashion from a small piece of green jade. The expression on its features was repellent in the extreme, savoring at once of death, bestiality, and malevolence. Around the base was an inscription in characters which neither St. John nor I could identify, and on the bottom, like a maker's seal, was graven a grotesque and formidable skull. Immediately upon beholding this amulet, we knew that we must possess it, that this treasure alone was our logical pelf from the centuried grave. Even had its outlines been unfamiliar, we would have desired it. But as we looked more closely, we saw that it was not wholly unfamiliar. Alien it indeed was to all art and literature, which sane and balanced readers know, but we recognized it as the thing hinted of in the forbidden Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazret, the ghastly sole symbol of the corpse-eating cult of inaccessible Leng in Central Asia. All too well did we trace the sinister lineaments described by the old Arab demonologists. Lineaments, he wrote, drawn from some obscure supernatural manifestation of the souls of those who vexed and gnawed at the dead. Seizing the green jade object, we gave a last glance at the bleached and cavern-eyed face of its owner and closed up the grave as we found it. As we hastened from that abhorrent spot, the stolen amulet in St. John's pocket, we thought we saw the bats descend in a body to the earth we had so lately rifled, as if seeking for some cursed and unholy nourishment. But the autumn moon shone weak and pale, we could not be sure. So too, as we sailed the next day away from Holland to our home, we thought we heard the faint, distant baying of some gigantic hound in the background. But the autumn wind moaned sad and wan, and we could not be sure. Less than a week after our return to England, strange things began to happen. We lived as recluses, devoid of friends, alone and without servants, in a few rooms of an ancient manor house on a bleak and unfrequented moor, so that our doors were seldom disturbed by the knock of the visitor. Now, however, we were troubled by what seemed to be frequent fumblings in the night, not only around the doors but around the windows also, upper as well as lower. Once we fancied that a large, opaque body darkened the library window when the moon was shining against it. And another time, we thought we heard a whirring or flapping sound not far off. On each occasion, investigation revealed nothing. We began to ascribe the occurrences to imagination alone. That same curiously disturbed imagination which still prolonged in our ears the faint, far baying we thought we heard in the Holland churchyard. The jade amulet now reposed in a niche in our museum, and sometimes we burned strangely scented candles before it. We read much in Alhazred's Necronomicon about its properties, and about the relation of ghouls' souls to the objects it symbolized, and were disturbed by what we read. Then, terror came. On the night of September 24th, I heard a knock at my chamber door. Fancying it St. John's, I bade the knocker enter, but was answered only by a shrill laugh. There was no one in the corridor. When I aroused St. John from his sleep, he professed entire ignorance of the event and became as worried as I. It was that night that the faint, distant baying over the moor became to us a certain and dreaded reality. 4 days later, whilst we were both in the hidden museum, there came a low, cautious scratching at the single door which led to the secret library staircase. Our alarm was now divided, for besides our fear of the unknown, we had always entertained a dread that our grisly collection might be discovered. Extinguishing all lights, we proceeded to the door and threw it suddenly open, whereupon we felt an unaccountable rush of air and heard, as if receding far away, a queer combination of rustling, tittering, and articulate chatter. Whether we were mad, dreaming, or in our senses, we did not try to determine. We only realized, with the blackest of apprehensions, that the apparently disembodied chatter was beyond a doubt in the Dutch language. After that, we lived in growing horror and fascination. Mostly we held to the theory that we were jointly going mad from our life of unnatural excitements, but sometimes it pleased us more to dramatize ourselves as the victims of some creeping and appalling doom. Bizarre manifestations were now too frequent to count. Our lonely house was seemingly alive with the presence of some malign being whose nature we could not guess, and every night that demonic baying rolled over the windswept moor, always louder and louder. On October 29, we found in the soft earth underneath the library window a series of footprints, utterly impossible to describe. They were as baffling as the hordes of great bats which haunted the old manor house in unprecedented and increasing numbers. The horror reached a culmination on November 18, when St. John, walking home after dark from the distant railway station, was seized by some frightful carnivorous thing and torn to ribbons. Screams had reached the house, and I had hastened to the terrible scene in time to hear a whir of wings and see a vague, black, cloudy thing silhouetted against the rising moon. My friend was dying when I spoke to him, and he could not answer coherently. All he could do was to whisper,
"The amulet. That damned thing."
Then he collapsed, an inert mass of mangled flesh. I buried him the next midnight in one of our neglected gardens and mumbled over his body one of the devilish rituals he had loved in life. And as I pronounced the last demonic sentence, I heard afar on the moor the faint baying of some gigantic hound. The moon was up, but I dared not look at it. And when I saw on the dim, lit moor a wide nebulous shadow sweeping from mound to mound, I shut my eyes and threw myself face down upon the ground. When I arose trembling, I know not how much later, I staggered into the house and made shocking obeisance before the enshrined amulet of green jade. Being now afraid to live alone in the ancient house on the moor, I departed on the following day for London, taking with me the amulet after destroying by fire and burial the rest of the impious collection in the museum. But after 3 nights, I heard the baying again, and before a week was over, felt strange eyes upon me whenever it was dark. One evening, as I strolled on Victoria Embankment for some needed air, I saw a black shape obscure one of the reflections of the lamps in the water. A wind stronger than the night wind rushed by, and I knew what had befallen St. John must soon befall me. The next day I carefully wrapped the green jade amulet and sailed for Holland. What mercy I might gain by returning the thing to its silent, sleeping owner I knew not. But I felt that I must at least try any step conceivably logical. What the hound was, and why it pursued me, were questions still vague. But I had first heard the baying in that ancient churchyard, and every subsequent event, including St. John's dying whisper, had served to connect the curse with the stealing of the amulet. Accordingly, I sank into the nethermost abysses of despair, when at the inn in Rotterdam I discovered that thieves had despoiled me of this sole means of salvation. The baying was loud that evening, and in the morning I read of a nameless deed in the vilest quarter of the city. The rabble were in terror, for upon an evil tenement had fallen a red death beyond the foulest previous crime of the neighborhood. In a squalid thieves' den, an entire family had been torn to shreds by an unknown thing which left no trace, and those around had heard all night, above the usual clamor of drunken voices, a faint, deep, insistent note as of a gigantic hound. So, at last, I stood again in that unwholesome churchyard where a pale winter moon cast hideous shadows and leafless trees drooped sullenly to meet the withered, frosty grass and cracking slabs, and the ivied church pointing a jeering finger at the unfriendly sky, and the night wind howled maniacally from over frozen swamps and frigid seas. The baying was very faint now, and it ceased altogether as I approached the ancient grave I had once violated and frightened away an abnormally large horde of bats which had been hovering curiously around it. I know not why I went thither unless to pray, or gibber out insane pleas and apologies to the calm white thing that lay within. But, whatever my reason, I attacked the half-frozen sod with a desperation partly mine and partly that of a dominating will outside myself. Excavation was much easier than I expected, though at one point I encountered a queer interruption when a lean vulture darted down out of the cold sky and pecked frantically at the grave earth until I killed him with a blow of my spade. Finally, I reached the rotting oblong box and removed the damp nitrous cover. This is the last rational act I ever performed, for crouched within that centuried coffin, embraced by a close-packed nightmare retinue of huge, sinewy sleeping bats, was the bony thing my friend and I had robbed, not clean and placid as we had seen it then, but covered with caked blood and shreds of alien flesh and hair, and leering sentiently at me with phosphorescent sockets and sharp, ensanguined fangs, yawning twistedly in mockery of my inevitable doom. And when it gave from those grinning jaws a deep, sardonic bay, as of some gigantic hound, and I saw that it held in its gory, filthy claw the lost and faithful amulet of green jade, I merely screamed and ran away idiotically, my screams soon dissolving into peals of hysterical laughter. Madness rides the star wind, claws and teeth sharpened on centuries of corpses, dripping death astride a bacchanal of bats from night black ruins of buried temples of Belial. Now, as the baying of that dead, fleshless monstrosity grows louder and louder, and the stealthy whirring and flapping of those accursed web wings circles closer and closer, I shall seek with my revolver the oblivion which is my only refuge from the unnamed and unnameable.
I have had what I believe to be the most remarkable day in my life, and while the events are still fresh in my mind, I wish to put them down on paper as clearly as possible. Let me say at the outset that my name is James Clarence Withencroft. I am 40 years old, in perfect health, never having known a day's illness. By profession, I am an artist, not a very successful one, but I earn enough money by my black and white work to satisfy my necessary wants. My only near relative, a sister, died 5 years ago, so that I am independent. I breakfasted this morning at 9, and after glancing through the morning paper, I lighted my pipe and proceeded to let my mind wander, in the hope that I might chance upon some subject from my pencil. The room, through door and windows were open, was oppressively hot, and I had just made up my mind that the coolest and most comfortable place in the neighborhood would be the deep end of the public swimming bath when the idea came. I began to draw. So intent was I on my work that I left my lunch untouched, only stopping work when the clock of St. Jude's struck 4. The final result for a hurried sketch was, I felt sure, the best thing I had done. It showed a criminal in the dock immediately after the judge had pronounced sentence. The man was fat, enormously fat. The flesh hung in rolls about his chin. It creased his huge, stumpy neck. He was clean-shaven. Perhaps I should say a few days before he must have been clean-shaven. And almost bald. He stood in the dock, his short, clumsy fingers clasping the rail, looking straight in front of him. The feeling that his expression conveyed was not so much one of horror as of utter, absolute collapse. There seemed nothing in the man strong enough to sustain that mountain of flesh. I rolled up the sketch and, without quite knowing why, I placed it in my pocket. Then, with a rare sense of happiness, which the knowledge of a good thing well done gives, I left the house. I believe that I set out with the idea of calling upon Trenton, for I remember walking along Lytton Street and turning to the right along Gilchrist Road, at the bottom of the hill where the men were at work on the new tram lines. From there onwards, I have only the vaguest recollection of where I went. The one thing of which I was fully conscious was the awful heat that came up from the dusty asphalt pavement, as an almost palpable wave. I longed for the thunder promised by the great banks of copper-colored cloud that hung low over the western sky. I must have walked 5 or 6 miles, when a small boy roused me from my reverie by asking the time. It was 20 minutes to 7. When he left me, I began to take stock of my bearings. I found myself standing before a gate that led into a yard bordered by a strip of thirsty earth, where there were flowers, purple stalk, and a scarlet geranium. Above the entrance was a board with the inscription, Chas Atkinson, Monumental Mason, Worker in English and Italian Marbles. From the yard itself came a cheery whistle, the noise of hammer blows and the cold sound of steel meeting stone. A sudden impulse made me enter. A man was sitting with his back towards me, busy at work on a slab of curiously veined marble. He turned around as he heard my steps and I stopped short. It was the man I had been drawing, whose portrait lay in my pocket. He sat there, huge and elephantine, the sweat pouring from his scalp, which he wiped with a red silk handkerchief. But though the face was the same, the expression was absolutely different. He greeted me smiling as if we were old friends, and he shook my hand. I apologized for my intrusion. "Everything is hot and glary outside," I said. "This seems to be an oasis in the wilderness." "I don't know about the oasis," he replied, "but it's certainly hot. As hot as hell. Take a seat, sir." He pointed to the end of the gravestone on which he was at work, and I sat down. "That's a beautiful piece of stone you've got hold of," I said. He shook his head. "In a way it is," he answered. "The surface here is as fine as anything you could wish. But there's a big flaw at the back, though. I don't expect you'd ever notice it. I could never really make a good job of a bit of marble like that. It would be all right in the summer like this. It wouldn't mind the blasted heat. But wait till winter comes, there's nothing quite like frost to find out the weak points in stone. Then what's it for? I asked. The man burst out laughing. You'd hardly believe me if I was to tell you it was for an exhibition. But it's the truth. Artists have exhibitions. So do grocers and butchers, and we have them too. All the latest little things in headstones, you know. He went on to talk of marbles which sort best withstood wind and rain and which were easiest to work, then of his garden and a new sort of carnation he had bought. At the end of every other minute he would drop his tools, wipe his shining head, and curse the heat. I said little, for I felt uneasy. There was something unnatural, uncanny in meeting this man. I tried at first to persuade myself that I'd seen him before, that his face, unknown to me, had found a place in some out-of-way corner of my memory, but I knew that I was practicing little more than a plausible piece of self-deception. Mr. Atkinson finished his work, spat on the ground, and got up with a sigh of relief. "There, what do you think of that?" he said, with an air of evident pride. The inscription which I read for the first time was this: "Sacred to the memory of James Clarence Withencroft, born January 18th, 1860. He passed away very suddenly on August 20th, 19... In the midst of life, we are in death. For some time, I sat in silence. Then a cold shudder ran down my spine. I asked him where he had seen the name. "Oh, I didn't see it anywhere," replied Mr. Atkinson. "I wanted some name and I put down the first that came into my head. Why do you want to know?" It's a strange coincidence, but it happens to be mine." He gave a long, low whistle. "And the dates?" "I can only answer for one of them, and that's correct. It's a rumgo," he said, but he knew less than I did. I told him of my morning's work. I took the sketch from my pocket and I showed it to him. As he looked, the expression of his face altered until it became more and more like that of the man I had drawn. "And it was only the day before yesterday," he said, "that I told Maria there were no such things as ghosts." Neither of us had seen a ghost, but I knew what he meant. "You probably heard my name," I said. "And you must have seen me somewhere and have forgotten it. Were you at Clacton-on-Sea last July?" I had never been to Clacton in my life. We were silent for some time. We were both looking at the same thing, the two dates on the gravestone, and one was right. "Come inside and have some supper," said Mr. Atkinson. His wife is a cheerful little woman with flaky red cheeks, of the country bred. Her husband introduced me as a friend of his who was an artist. The result was unfortunate, for after the sardines and watercress had been removed, she brought out a Dore Bible, and I had to sit and express my admiration for nearly half an hour. I went outside and found Atkinson sitting on the gravestone smoking.
We resumed the conversation at the point we had left off. "You must excuse my asking," I said, "but do you know of anything you've done for which you could be put on trial?" He shook his head.
"I'm not a bankrupt. The business is prosperous enough.
3 years ago I gave turkeys to some of the guardians at Christmas. But that's all I can think of. And there were small ones, too," he added as an afterthought. He got up, fetched a can from the porch, and began to water the flowers.
"Twice a day, regular in the hot weather," he said. "And then the heat sometimes gets the better of the delicate ones. And ferns, good Lord, they could never stand it. Where do you live?"
I told him my address. It would take an hour's quick walk to get back home.
"It's like this," he said. "We'll look at the matter straight. If you go back home tonight, you take your chance of accidents. A cart may run over you, and there's always banana skins and orange peels, to say nothing of falling ladders."
He spoke of the improbable with an intense seriousness that would have been laughable 6 hours before. But I did not laugh.
"The best thing we can do," he continued, "is for you to stay here till 12 o'clock. We'll go upstairs and smoke. It may be cooler inside."
To my surprise, I agreed. We are sitting now in a long, low room beneath the eaves. Atkinson has sent his wife to bed. He himself is busy sharpening some tools at a little oilstone, smoking one of my cigars the while. The air seems charged with thunder. I am writing this at a shaky table before the open window. The leg is cracked, and Atkinson, who seems a handy man with his tools, is going to mend it as soon as he finished putting an edge on his chisel. It is after 11 now. I shall be gone in less than an hour, but the heat is stifling. It is enough to send a man mad.
Part 1. In an upper room of an unoccupied dwelling in the part of San Francisco known as North Beach lay the body of a man under a sheet. The hour was near 9 in the evening. The room was dimly lighted by a single candle. Although the weather was warm, the two windows, contrary to the custom which gives the dead plenty of air, were closed and the blinds drawn down. The furniture of the room consisted of but 3 pieces: an armchair, a small reading stand supporting the candle, and a long kitchen table, supporting the body of the man. All these, as also the corpse, seemed to have been recently brought in, for an observer, had there been one, would have seen that all were free from dust, whereas everything else in the room was pretty thickly coated with it. And there were cobwebs in the angles of the walls. Under the sheet, the outlines of the body could be traced, even the features, these having that unnaturally sharp definition which seems to belong to faces of the dead, but is really characteristic of those only that have been wasted by disease. From the silence of the room, one would rightly have inferred that it was not in front of the house, facing a street. It really faced nothing but a high breast of rock, the rear of the building being set into a hill. As a neighboring church clock was striking 9 with an indolence which seemed to imply such an indifference to the fight of time that one could hardly help wondering why it took the trouble to strike at all. The single door of the room was opened, and a man entered.
advancing toward the body. As he did so, the door closed, apparently of its own volition. There was a grating, as of a key turned with difficulty, and the snap of a lockbolt as it shot into its socket. A sound of retiring footsteps in the passage outside ensued, and the man was to all appearance a prisoner. Advancing to the table, he stood a moment looking down at the body, then with a slight shrug of the shoulders, walked over to one of the windows and hoisted the blind. The darkness outside was absolute. The panes were covered with dust. But by wiping this away, he could see that the window was fortified with strong iron bars crossing it within a few inches of the glass and embedded in the masonry on each side. He examined the other window. It was the same. He manifested no greater curiosity in the matter, did not even so much as raise the sash. If he was a prisoner, he was apparently a tractable one. Having completed his examination of the room, he seated himself in the armchair, took a book from his pocket, drew the stand with its candle alongside, and began to read. The man was young, not more than 30, dark in complexion, smooth-shaven with brown hair. His face was thin and high-nosed, with a broad forehead and a firmness of the chin and jaw, which is said by those having it to denote resolution. The eyes were gray and steadfast, not moving except with definitive purpose. They were now, for the greater part of the time, fixed upon his book, but he occasionally withdrew them and turned them to the body on the table, not apparently from any dismal fascination, which under such circumstances it might be supposed to exercise upon even a courageous person, nor with a conscious rebellion against the contrary influence which might dominate. A timid one. He looked at it as if in his reading he had come upon something recalling him to a sense of his surroundings. Clearly this watcher, by the dead, was discharging his trust with intelligence and composure, as became him. After reading for perhaps a half hour, he seemed to come to the end of a chapter and quietly laid away the book. He then rose, and taking the reading stand from the floor, carried it into a corner of the room near one of the windows, lifted the candle from it, and returned to the empty fireplace before which he had been sitting. A moment later he walked over to the body on the table, lifted the sheet, and turned it back from the head, exposing a mass of dark hair and a thin face cloth, beneath which the features showed with even sharper definition than before. Shading his eyes by interposing his free hand between them and the candle, he stood looking at his motionless companion with a serious and tranquil regard. Satisfied with his inspection, he pulled the sheet over the face again, and returning to the chair, took some matches off the candlestick, put them in the side pocket of his sack coat, and sat down. He then lifted the candle from its socket and looked at it critically, as if calculating how long it would last. It was barely 2 inches long. In another hour, he would be in darkness. He replaced it in the candlestick and blew it out. Part 2. In a physician's office in Kearney Street, 3 men sat about a table, drinking punch and smoking. It was late in the evening, almost midnight indeed, and there had been no lack of punch. The gravest of the 3, Dr. Helberson, was the host. It was in his rooms they sat. He was about 30 years of age. The others were even younger. All were physicians.
"The superstitious awe with which the living regard the dead,"
said Dr. Helberson,
"is hereditary and incurable. One needs no more be ashamed of it than the fact that he inherits, for example, an incapacity for mathematics or a tendency to lie."
The others laughed.
"Oughtn't a man be ashamed to lie?"
asked the youngest of the 3, who was in fact a medical student not yet graduated.
"My dear Harper, I said nothing about that. The tendency to lie is one thing. Lying is another."
"But do you think,"
said the 3rd man,
"that this superstitious feeling, this fear of the dead, reasonless as we know it to be, is universal? I am myself not conscious of it."
"Oh, but it is in your system for all that,"
replied Helberson.
It needs only the right conditions, what Shakespeare calls the Confederate season, to manifest itself in some very disagreeable way that will open your eyes. Physicians and soldiers are, of course, more nearly free from it than others.
Physicians and soldiers? Why don't you add hangmen and headsmen? Let us have in all the assassin classes.
No, my dear Mancher. The juries will not let the public executioners acquire sufficient familiarity with death to be altogether unmoved by it.
Young Harper, who had been helping himself to a fresh cigar at the sideboard, resumed his seat.
What would you consider conditions under which any man or woman born would become insupportably conscious of his share of our common weakness in this regard?
He asked, rather verbosely.
Well, I should say that if a man were locked up all night with a corpse, alone, in a dark room of a vacant house, with no bed cover to pull over his head, and lived through it without going altogether mad, he might justly boast himself not of woman born, nor yet, like Macduff, a product of Caesarean section.
I thought you would never finish piling up conditions,
said Harper.
But I know a man who is neither a physician nor a soldier, who will accept them all, for any stake you like to name.
Who is he?
His name is Jarrett, a stranger here. He comes from my town in New York. I have no money to back him, but he will back himself with loads of it.
How do you know that?
He'd rather bet than eat. As for fear, I dare say he thinks it's some cutaneous disorder, or possibly a particular kind of religious heresy.
What does he look like?
Halverson was evidently becoming interested.
Like Mancher here. Might be his twin brother.
I accept the challenge,
said Halverson promptly.
Awfully obliged to you for the compliment, I'm sure,
drawled Mancher, who was growing sleepy.
Hey, can I get into this?
Not against me,
Halverson said.
I don't want your money.
All right,
said Mancher.
I'll be the corpse.
The outcome of this crazy conversation we have seen. Part 3. In extinguishing his meager allowance of candle, Mr. Jarrett's object was to preserve it against some unforeseen need. He may have thought, too, or half thought, that the darkness would be no worse at one time than another, and if the situation became insupportable, it would be better to have means of relief, or even release. At any rate, it was wise to have a little reserve of light, even if only to enable him to look at his watch. No sooner had he blown out the candle and set it on the floor at his side than he settled himself comfortably in the armchair, leaned back and closed his eyes, hoping and expecting to sleep. In this he was disappointed. He had never in his life felt less sleepy, and in a few minutes he gave up the attempt. But what could he do? He could not go groping about in absolute darkness, at the risk of bruising himself, at the risk, too, of blundering against the table, and rudely disturbing the dead. We all recognize their right to lie at rest, with immunity from all that is harsh and violent. Jarrett almost succeeded in making himself believe that considerations of this kind restrained him from risking the collision and fixed him to the chair. While thinking of this matter, he fancied that he heard a faint sound in the direction of the table. What kind of sound he could hardly have explained. He did not turn his head. Why should he? In the darkness? But he listened. Why should he not? And listening, he grew giddy and grasped the arms of the chair for support. There was a strange ringing in his ears. His head seemed bursting. His chest was oppressed by the constriction of his clothing. He wondered why it was so, and whether these were symptoms of fear. Then, with a long and strong expiration, his chest appeared to collapse. And with the great gasp with which he refilled his exhausted lungs, the vertigo left him, and he knew that so intently had he listened that he had held his breath almost to suffocation. The revelation was vexatious. He arose, pushed away the chair with his foot, and strode to the center of the room. But one does not stride far in darkness. He began to grope, and finding the wall, followed it to an angle, turned,
followed it past 2 windows, and there, in another corner, came into violent contact with the reading stand, overturning it. It made a clatter that startled him. He was annoyed.
Ah! How the devil could I have forgotten where it was?
He muttered, and groped his way along the 3rd wall to the fireplace.
I must put things to rights,
said he, feeling the floor for the candle. Having recovered that, he lighted it, and instantly turned his eyes to the table, where naturally nothing had undergone any change. The reading stand lay unobserved upon the floor. He had forgotten to put it to rights. He looked all about the room, dispersing the deeper shadows by movements of the candle in his hand, and crossing over to the door, tested it by turning and pulling the knob with all his strength. It did not yield, and this seemed to afford him a certain satisfaction. Indeed, he secured it more firmly by a bolt, which he had not before observed. Returning to his chair, he looked at his watch. It was 9:30. With a start of surprise, he held the watch at his ear. It had not stopped. The candle was now visibly shorter. He again extinguished it, placing it on the floor at his side as before. Mr. Jarrett was not at his ease. He was distinctly dissatisfied with his surroundings, and with himself for being so. What have I to fear, he thought. This is ridiculous and disgraceful. I will not be so great a fool, but courage does not come of saying, I will be courageous, nor of recognizing its appropriateness to the occasion. The more Jarrett condemned himself, the more reason he gave himself for condemnation, the greater the number of variations which he played upon the simple theme of the harmlessness of the dead, the more insupportable grew the discord of his emotions.
What?
He cried aloud in the anguish of his spirit.
What shall I, who have not a shade of superstitious in my nature, I who have no belief in immortality, I who now, and never more clearly than now, that the afterlife is the dream of a desire, shall I lose at once my bet, my honor, my self-respect, perhaps my reason? Because certain savage ancestors dwelling in caves and burrows conceived the monstrous notion that the dead walk by night. That.
Distinctly, unmistakably, Mr. Jarrett heard behind him a light, soft sound of footfalls, deliberate, regular, successively nearer. Part 4. Just before daybreak the next morning, Dr. Helberson and his young friend Harper were driving slowly through the streets of North Beach in the doctor's coupe.
Have you still the confidence of youth and the courage or stolidity of your friend?
Said the elder man.
Do you believe that I have lost this wager?
I know you have,
replied the other, with enfeebling emphasis.
Well, upon my soul, I hope so.
It was spoken earnestly, almost solemnly. There was silence for a few moments.
Harper,
the doctor resumed, looking very serious in the shifting half-lights that entered the carriage as they passed the street lamps.
I don't feel altogether comfortable about this business. If your friend had not irritated me by the contemptuous manner in which he treated my doubt of his endurance, a purely physical quality, and by the cool incivility of his suggestion that the corpse be that of a physician, I should not have gone on with it. If anything should happen, we are ruined, as I fear we deserve to be.
What can happen? Even if the matter should be taking a serious turn, of which I am not at all afraid, Mancher has only to resurrect himself and explain matters. With a genuine subject from the dissecting room or one of your lay patients, it might be different.
Dr. Mancher then had been as good as his promise. He was the corpse. Dr. Helberson was silent for a long time, as the carriage, at a snail's pace, crept along the same street it had traveled 2 or 3 times already. Presently he spoke.
Well, let us hope that Mancher, if he has had to rise from the dead, has been discreet about it. A mistake in that might make matters worse instead of better.
Yes,
said Harper.
Dread would kill him. But, Doctor,
looking at his watch as the carriage passed the gas lamp,
it is nearly 4 o'clock at last.
A moment later, the two had quitted the vehicle and were walking briskly towards the long, unoccupied house belonging to the doctor, in which they had immured Dr. Jarrett in accordance with the terms of the mad wager. As they neared it, they met a man running.
Can you tell me?
He cried, suddenly checking his speed.
Where I can find a doctor?
What's the matter?
Helberson asked, non-committal.
Ghosts! Go and see for yourself,
said the man, resuming his running. They hastened on, arrived at the house. They saw several persons entering in haste and excitement in some of the dwellings nearby, and across the way, the chamber windows were thrown up, showing a protrusion of heads. All heads were asking questions, none heeding the questions of the others. A few of the windows with closed blinds were illuminated. The inmates of those rooms were dressing to come down. Exactly opposite the door of the house that they sought a street lamp threw a yellow, insufficient light upon the scene, seeming to say that it could disclose a good deal more if it wished. Harper paused at the door and laid a hand upon his companion's arm.
It's all up with us, Doctor,
he said in extreme agitation, which contrasted strangely with his free and easy words.
The game has gone against us all. Let's not go in there. I'm for lying low.
I'm a physician,
said Dr. Helberson calmly.
There may be need of one.
They mounted the doorsteps and were about to enter. The door was open. The street lamp opposite lighted the passage into which it opened. It was full of men. Some had ascended the stairs at the farther end and denied admittance above, waited for better fortune. All were talking, none listening. Suddenly, on the upper landing there was a great commotion. A man had sprung out of a door and was breaking away from those endeavoring to detain him. Down through the mass of affrighted idlers he came, pushing them aside, flattening them against the wall on one side, or compelling them to cling to the rail on the other, clutching them by the throat, striking them savagely, thrusting them back down the stairs and walking over the fallen. His clothes was in disorder. He was without a hat. His eyes, wild and restless, had in them something more terrifying than his apparently superhuman strength. His face, smooth-shaven, was bloodless, his hair frost-white. As the crowd at the foot of the stairs, having more freedom, fell away to let him pass, Harper sprang forward.
Jarrett! Jarrett!
He cried. Dr. Helberson seized Harper by the collar and dragged him back. The man looked into their faces without seeming to see them and sprang through the door, down the steps, into the street, and away. A stout policeman who had had inferior success in conquering his way down the stairway followed a moment later and started in pursuit. All the heads in the windows, those of women and children now, screaming in guidance. The stairway being now partly cleared, most of the crowd having rushed down to the street to observe the flight and pursuit. Dr. Helberson mounted to the landing, followed by Harper. At a door in the upper passage, an officer denied them admittance.
We are physicians,
said the doctor, and they passed in. The room was full of men, dimly seen crowded about a table. The newcomers edged their way forward, looked over the shoulders of those in the front rank. Upon the table, the lower limbs covered with a sheet, lay the body of a man, brilliantly illuminated by the beam of a bull's-eye lantern held by a policeman standing at the feet. The others, excepting those near the head, the officer himself, were all in darkness. The face of the body showed yellow, repulsive, horrible. The eyes were partly open and upturned, and the jaw fallen. Traces of froth defiled the lips, the chin, the cheeks. A tall man, evidently a doctor, bent over the body with his hand thrust under the shirt front. He withdrew it and placed his 2 fingers in the open mouth.
This man has been about 6 hours dead,
said he.
It is a case for the coroner.
He drew a card from his pocket, handed it to the officer, and made his way toward the door.
Clear the room! Out all!
Said the officer, sharply, and the body disappeared as if it had been snatched away. As shifting the lantern, He flashed its beam of light here and there against the faces of the crowd. The effect was amazing. The men, blinded, confused, almost terrified, made a tumultuous rush for the door, pushing, crowding, and tumbling over one another as they fled, like the hosts of night before the shafts of Apollo. Upon the struggling, trampling mass, the officer poured his light without pity and without cessation. Caught in the current, Halverson and Harper were swept out of the room and cascaded down the stairs into the street.
Good God, Doctor! Did I not tell you the dread would kill him?
Said Harper, as soon as they were clear of the crowd.
I believe you did,
replied the other, without apparent emotion. They walked on in silence, block after block. Against the graying east, the dwellings of the hill tribes showed in silhouette. The familiar milk wagon was already astir in the streets. The baker's man would soon come upon the scene. The newspaper carrier was abroad in the land.
It strikes me, youngster,
said Halverson,
that you and I have been having too much of the morning air lately. It is unwholesome. We need a change. What do you say to a tour in Europe?
When?
I'm not particular. I should suppose at 4 o'clock this afternoon would be early enough.
I'll meet you at the boat,
said Harper. 7 years afterward, these two men sat upon a bench in Madison Square, New York, in familiar conversation. Another man, who had been observing them for some time, himself unobserved, approached, and courteously lifting his hat from locks as white as frost, said,
I beg your pardon, gentlemen, but when you have killed a man by coming to life, it is best to change clothes with him, and at the first opportunity, make a break for liberty.
Halverson and Harper exchanged significant glances. They were obviously amused. The former then looked the stranger kindly in the eye and replied,
That's always been my plan. I entirely agree with you. To its advantage.
He stopped suddenly, rose, and went white. He stared at the man, open-mouthed. He trembled visibly.
Ah,
said the stranger.
I see that you are indisposed, Doctor. If you cannot treat yourself, Dr. Harper can do something for you, I'm sure. Who the devil are you?
Said Harper bluntly. The stranger came nearer, and bending towards them, said in a whisper,
I call myself Jared sometimes, but I don't mind telling you, for old friendship, that I am Dr. William Mancher.
The revelation brought Harper to his feet.
Mancher?
He cried, and Halverson added,
It's true, by God!
Yes,
said the stranger, smiling vaguely.
It is true enough, no doubt.
He hesitated and seemed to be trying to recall something, then began humming a popular air. He had apparently forgotten their presence.
Look here, Mancher,
said the elder of the two.
Tell us just what occurred that night to Jarrett. You know.
Oh, yes, about Jarrett,
said the other.
It's odd. I should have neglected to tell you. I tell it so often. You see, I knew, by overhearing him talking to himself, that he was pretty badly frightened. So I couldn't resist the temptation to come to life, have a bit of fun at him. I couldn't really. That was all right, though certainly I did not think he would take it so seriously. I did not, truly. And afterward, well, it was a tough job changing places with him, and then, damn you! You didn't let me out!
Nothing could exceed the ferocity with which these last words were delivered. Both men stepped back in alarm.
Why?
Halverson stammered, losing his self-possession utterly.
We had nothing to do with it.
Didn't I say you were Doctors Hellborn and Sharper?
Inquired the man, laughing.
My name is Halverson, yes, and this gentleman is Mr. Harper,
replied the former, reassured by the laugh.
But we are not physicians now. We are, well, hang it, old man, we are gamblers.
And that was the truth.
A very good profession, very good indeed. And by the way, I hope Sharper here paid over Jarrett's money like an honest stakeholder. A very good and honorable profession.
He repeated, thoughtfully, moving carelessly away.
But I stick to the old one. I am High Supreme Medical Officer of the Bloomingdale Asylum. It is my duty to cure the superintendent.